Who is getting us started?
So that would be Emily from Josephine
Okay.
County Emergency Management.
Okay, welcome, Emily.
My audio here? How's that? Okay. All right. So, you, as new mayor and somewhat new mix of council members, haven't had much of a chance to get to know me and my department. We sort of were cart before the horse, and we're working on a bunch of projects and getting information from each other, and I hadn't had a chance to really introduce myself properly. So we'll probably do that later on when most of my team is here, but just a quick overview of what we do and why in Josephine County. You can see it here, I won't read through it. But it's out of some of these elements that I'm here today, and partly through the IGA for the city, to talk about evacuation planning at your request. So we're going to talk about a little bit about an overview of jurisdictions, zones, routes, and alerts, and then I'll have a Q&A and get more feedback from you guys. So when it comes to jurisdictions on wildfire evacuations, a brief summary is that fire agencies have the lead on ground and air response operations. They assess conditions, they advise on needs on scene. Law enforcement has scene security, traffic control. They support the event as requested and have lead in evacuation operations with input from fire. Emergency management supports both when and where requested. So that's kind of the high level view. I just want to note that every event can have unique factors. And so an example of that might be there could be a situation when law enforcement is first on scene because they happen to be responding to a totally different law enforcement call round the corner and there's a fire, right? So it could also happen, and it happens often, that fire is on scene and never involves law enforcement. So it just depends on the level of activity and need. But things to consider when you talk about who has jurisdiction and how things roll out. And then just a reminder, I know we're very fire focused, especially this time of year, but evacuations can happen for floods, snow, hazmat. Fire is only one hazard to consider. So if we're going to have a zoning conversation, a decision will have to be made. What is the purpose for these zones? Are they all hazard? Or are they fire specific? So that's a conversation piece to think about. So when we talk about zones, temporary zones are things we already do and have always done. Sometimes they're more formal than others, but every time you're alerting, every time you're drawing a square or a circle on a map, you're essentially creating a zone. Sometimes they call it a polygon, a shapefile, what have you, but temporary zones happen often, and they are what we alert to already. So what you're asking about and what City of Medford and other places have done are permanent zones, meaning they're always the same no matter what, and they're not shifting according to the hazard or the location. We have some permanent zones already in use and in our databases to pull, and those are zip code based, public safety power shutoff zones, which have been set by Pacific Power in our region, and flood zones. Permanent zones for wildfire have advantages as well as disadvantages. And I want to bring this to your attention because when you talk about it with the public, I want you to have kind of a full context before you make your decisions. So on the plus side, zones can be a really wonderful public education tool. It can be hard to get people to care about something and feel motivated about something unless they feel personally impacted. So we see that in emergencies over and over again when they say, well, I didn't care until my house was in danger or my neighborhood was in danger, and then all of a sudden they're like, what can I do to be better prepared? And that's great. A permanent zone makes it personal because now you can, quote unquote, know your zone, as the saying goes. So now you have something personally attached to your area that you can look to. So that can help with public education. It can maybe improve traffic flows and alerting use in pre-coordinated zone evacuations, meaning all the first responders who are involved know what zone M3P is, and you've already had discussions about it, and it's not changing incident to incident. So that can maybe help. And it can be easier for locals to understand the location. So we get a lot of circumstances when we're sending out an alert to struggle to describe something that people can grasp. People struggle with mile markers, mileposts. Where's milepost 35? I have no idea. or John Street. I've never been down John Street, so we can provide a map and we can provide a description, but sometimes having an established zone could be easier for them to understand when we alert to it. The challenge side, tsunamis and floods move in predictable directions. Fires not so much, especially at the start. You need to consider, what if only one corner of your permanent zone needs to be alerted? So when you establish a permanent zone, you're sort of, I don't want to say stuck, but you can only alert to it one tier at a time, right? Because it's a solid section. There's no breaking it up. So if this was a singular, this triangle was a singular zone here, and I wanted the upper corner of it, I'm talking with sheriff and law enforcement and fire, and they're saying, we want the upper right-hand corner to just be level 1, be ready, but the rest should be level 2. Once I have a permanent zone, I don't have a way to break that in half or break a corner off without still making a temporary zone. So I could make all of it level 2, and then I'll have to redraw, or we'll have to reinitiate just a corner of it and say, you're actually a level 1. There's considerations there. It does lock you in to a certain extent. Paradise had permanent zones. Just as a reminder, there's no good or bad in that. Just want to emphasize, fast-moving, rapid disasters are always going to be complicated. And my concern in conversations with the public is that the feeling that zones are going to be the thing to say, if I'm in a zone, I'm going to be safe. That's not necessarily the case. Alerts could be perfect. The coordinated response could be perfect. And if the winds are 60 miles per hour, houses are still going to burn. And that's nobody's fault. So I just don't want there to be a false sense of security that the public gets if you move ahead with this. And I say a zone is still just a line without personal preparedness. I can give a level 3. Sheriff can recommend that folks get on a level 3. We can identify perfectly where the threat is, and people can still fail to act, choose not to act, be unprepared to act. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to be ready to go without that public education piece. So I know there's been a lot of talk about what we're calling the Medford approach. There are other cities in Jackson County that have done the Medford approach. So I have a little example of a map. I'm sure many of you are aware of it. And then want to make sure you know about Zone Haven as well, because Zone Haven is another trendy topic when we're talking about permanent zones, especially for wildfire. So what some cities in Jackson County have done, most publicly familiar is City of Medford, is they sat down with first responders, GIS, Public Works, all those folks, and broke their jurisdiction out into permanent zones, named them, labeled them, and then pushed it out to the public with a sort of Know Your Zone campaign. And when you go log into the address of your neighborhood or your specific home or business, it says also know your evacuation routes. And so you click on that and it will pull up a static PDF of all the potential primary arterial routes in and out of your zone. And so there's an emphasis to know here are all your ways in and out of your zone, learn them, know them, and then choose the best one based on conditions in the field and advisories in your alert. So that's one approach that's out there. Zone Haven is a very high-end, fairly expensive software program. It started in California. It's only about 2 years old, maybe 3 years old now. The state of Oregon has pre-purchased a pilot program through Zone Haven to do permanent zone mapping in areas of Deschutes County as well as areas of Jackson County. And we were hoping to have see that across the state, see that pilot project be finalized, and then in the fall sort of sit down with Jackson and with Deschutes County and say, how did you like Zone Haven? Is this something you're going to move forward? How much did it cost you for yearly subscriptions, things like that? So Zone Haven has an internal software program built for first responders, as well as an external mapping program for the public. Similar kind of thing, know your zone. You can get a cool little printout with some safety tips. Both still require public education. They both say learn all your possible routes, then select the best one. So I think there's also, my concern is there's also a little bit of a misconception that these Know Your Zone programs will identify and show you the best route during an incident, and that's not necessarily the case. So there's still going to have to be some input from first responders, and there's still going to have to be some personal citizen decision-making. It's not to the point yet of a cool thing that you can pull up on your phone and drop your pin and map the direction of the fire in real life time for you as a citizen and have it tell you I-5 South is best for you. So I just also want to make sure that that's an understanding of where those pieces lie. When we talk about alerting, because zoning and alerting go together, or they should go together, right? So I can have zones, but what's the purpose of zones if we're not going to utilize them to tell people advisories? So we're going to have, or you're going to have, whoever you decide to assign to this, conversations. At what point are you going to utilize your zones? What are your trigger points going to be? Are they only going to be for certain levels or certain types of hazards? And then what emergency alerting tools are you going to use? And who's going to be the point person for that? So who's going to be told, okay, go ahead and hit that red button for zone MP3. So there has to be some connectivity there that hasn't happened yet. I personally, in my emergency management department, have 3 primary emergency alerting tools. So I just want to run through those because people aren't always familiar with them. One is called Citizen Alert. Citizen Alert we've had since 2015 in Josephine County. It's the same system we share with Jackson County through the Everbridge platform. The state has now purchased Everbridge at a statewide level, and every county and tribe has the ability to have this local alerting system. It's called OR Alert at the state level. For us, it's still Citizen Alert. It's still the system we've always had. What the benefit was for us when the state did that is it bumped up our access to a few more tools we couldn't afford within the system, which is good, and more training, which we couldn't afford before. So Citizen Alert, as a tool, I kind of refer to it as a scalpel. It has very specific to broad reach, meaning if I hear from folks in the field that they want just a house or a block notified, I can do that. Right? So it can be very, very specific, or it can be quite broad. There are opt-ins where people choose to participate in the system, but also there's the reverse 911, which is automatically included, which is all the landlines in the county. So when we say we do the reverse 911, we have that database that's been vetted through them, and in emergency life safety, we can hit that and call every landline. The purpose of the opt-ins is to say, aside from those landlines, do you also want your cell phone, your email, your text? And that's where the opt-ins have come in. Through OR Alert, there are now new functions that I'll be rolling out. One of those is to text your zip code. So that's something that I'm going to be putting out a press release on here probably towards the end of the week to help inform folks that very soon, the next few days, they'll be able to text their zip code in Josephine County to Citizen Alert, and they'll get all the emergency evacuation alerts that have happened within their zip code, regardless of whether or not their location or their account was within that incident polygon or zone, if that makes sense. So that's a bit of a new feature. There are also community keywords that I would like to come back to the city at some point and see if you want to utilize, which you can have. I can reserve and build for them, and they can be used for non-life safety messaging to your residents within your jurisdiction. That can be for like water outages or cooling center sites, that sort of stuff that typically before we used to say, we don't really use Citizen Alert for that. Now, if we give you a City of Grants Pass opt-in keyword, we can utilize that because we're not using the 911 data sets. Right? Those are folks who are just opting in for non-life safety information, like a flash alert. So I know that was a lot, but it's important to me that you understand the tools that we have because you're the ones talking to the citizens about it usually. So then there's WEA, which you might have heard about. It's the wireless emergency alert. It's the stuff that takes over your cellular towers in an area or a zone that we initiate. I referred to that as a shovel. It has wide to broad reach. Like I said, it takes over cellular towers. I cannot go small. Like if I try to alert something a mile in radius or less, WEA can't pick it up. It has to be broader than that. And it does have some bleed over or slop. In some places it's been very small, 1/10 of a mile. In some places they've alerted a jurisdiction 30 miles away. It just depends what cell towers you're picking up in that area that you're alerting. So we just need to be very thoughtful when we utilize WIA. We can do it, we have it, we test to it. That's not a problem if people or first responders want it. It's important to know I am character limited in those alerts. For older phones, they only give me 90 characters to make an alert. And for more modern phones, 260 characters. So I have to take the information that they feed me from the field and strip it down to its barest nuggets and still make it palatable and reasonable to people on the other end. So that's a challenge sometimes, especially when there's a time factor, but we do practice to it. You may read in some places WIA, the Wireless Emergency Alert System. These are all through FEMA. These two are WIA and EAS are through FEMA at the federal level. Has an additional 360 character limit box that I can alert to, but less than 20% of all cell phones across the United States have that capability to receive those larger character limits. So I just don't use it because I have to alert to the lower denomination of the majority of the folks. So we just don't even utilize that till more people can receive those. EAS, the Emergency Alert System, I kind of refer to that as the PLOW. It has a broad 6-county reach through the broadcasting regional TV and radio. That's what kind of that more traditional, the banner across your TV, that kind of stuff. So EAS, same thing. We have it. We can use it if it's asked for. We test to it. Voice-wise, I have no limits, but there's a 260 character text limit and additional things that you have to know for the system, but it does exist and it is available. So those are those 3 tools that can be utilized with zoning or anything else. And then just as part of the general alerting conversation, I noted that there are other things. NOAA, National Weather Service often use WIA and EAS. Oregon State Police uses amber and silver alerts. I don't send those. Sometimes people get confused, like, why'd you send me that amber alert? Usually that's through Oregon State Police. Local agencies use flash alert, such as ODOT or Sheriff's Office. We'll send out press releases through something like Flash Alert. And you can have private employer systems, which are their own emergency alerting, such as internal to a hospital. So I know that was a lot. But again, just trying to give you some context of the tools that we're working with. And I just wanted to let folks know, if you hadn't thought of it this way before, but the alert doesn't stop the fire or the flood. It's an awareness tool to help encourage action. And it cannot happen in a vacuum without coordination from the field. And so that's how that flow occurs and what its purpose is for. Sorry. My final slide is just some ending thoughts generally on evacuation planning. Just an encouragement to keep everyone in the loop as much as possible, an encouragement for you to commit to create a strong public education campaign that parallels whatever public product you're pushing out if you decide to do that. So I'm not sure that you can have one without the other. And then just a reminder, so you understand that yes, there's a role for permanent zones, but there will always still be temporary zones that can differ from those permanent zones. So you're like, under certain hazards, you're likely to have an integration of both. Questions?
Thanks. What questions do you have? Joel and then Valerie.
Thank you for coming and a good presentation. I was thinking of, in my mind, a simulation where would something happen like at Cathedral Hills, which is administered by the Bureau of Land Management, a federal agency. ODF has jurisdiction for the fire. I assume under interagency, the city and perhaps the county would respond. Who is responsible for pushing the trigger for evacuations? When you have these multiple jurisdictions, who pushes the button for evacuations within the city? That's the first question. Second question, talking with the Honorable Vanessa, and she had some very legitimate concerns about, because everybody calls her, okay, and dispatch. And who, at the same time, coordinates with dispatch, and I'm sure there's multiple dispatches. You got ODF's dispatch, you got 911 at the county, under emergency. You have various ways. Who from the fire end of things, when that strike team leader shows up on the field and says, well, it's out of control, we need to push the button, is that chain of command established?
Yeah, I
And-
can speak to that, but
and-
our
and-
more
And where do we
experienced.
go from there?
Yes, to all of that. Lang Johnson, Deputy Chief, Grants Pass Fire Rescue. So to answer your question, so the initial attack units that come in were coordinated. We don't care about whose jurisdiction, we don't care whose ground it is. All agencies are interconnected, we all respond at the same time. First units in will establish command, we'll start coordinating immediately, and if there's a need based on fire growth and behavior for evacuations, we will start to initiate that in the field, and then we'll start sharing that with law enforcement to start pushing that out, and then that'll work through emergency management, and then all of our dispatch centers are also coordinated in it. So that's a lot of stuff that takes place while we're also dragging hoses, right, and coordinating aircraft and trying to keep people safe. So it doesn't happen in a rapid fashion, but it happens as part of the overall coordinated response. And when you're talking about initial attack, you're within about half an hour, 45 minutes to an hour before the scene and the management of that incident really starts to build up and starts to work towards getting ahead of the incident. Because you're talking about something that's rapidly accelerating, and it takes time to pull those resources and those organizations together. But that's a pretty typical timeline for how we do stuff, and then how we share that communications information and start pushing out the needs for evacuation.
So the first part of that is always there's a lot of unknowns, and it's pretty chaotic. We had several patients who survived down in Paradise, and they had zones ahead of time in the city, and they actually followed that, and it led them right into the fire.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
they had to turn around, and they almost didn't make it.
That's one of the challenges to permanent zoning, because in an event, fire doesn't care where jurisdictional boundaries are at or any lines we draw on the map. A fire is going to do what a fire is going to do according to weather, topography, fuels, a whole lot of conditions we have very little or limited control over during the time of the incident. We can do stuff ahead of time, but we can't do a lot during the incident depending on what the main driver is. We have a tendency in this county and this communities, in our communities, to work more with the temporary, because we have the ability to design the evacuation zone as needed that meets the incident. Sure. And
So then during that incident, how are we assured that dispatch is giving out the right information, or 911's giving out the right information?
you're not going to be assured. We're going to do the best we can, but we can't guarantee anything. There is so much change in the incident from the moment that we make the decision to issue out the information to get it to dispatch, dispatch gets it out to the community, the fires change dynamics. And so we're constantly a little bit behind the incident in order to get the information out, and it's not until well into the event that we can get the resources, staffing, and the necessary mechanisms in play. There is no assured magic bullet to doing this. It's about being dedicated to it and putting as much energy as we can to be as proactive as possible.
Sure. So with that, then, you have the folks that are initially attacking the fire, and they're seeing what's going on. Then do you have, at the same time, someone who is back in the office, hears the radio traffic, understands what's going on, and then starts to future out and strategically think about where we're headed and what we need to do?
We're doing that in the field.
You're doing
We
that
don't
in the field.
have enough resources to have that luxury, so all of us are doing that in the field as part of the command post and part of the
Is there any
involvement of
way
that.
we can get resources to do that so that the person in the field can be freed up to fight the fire, and that strategic thinking can occur beyond that?
We're multitaskers.
Okay.
I would love to have that ability, but the reality of being able to field those resources in this current environment is going to be really difficult to do. You're talking about significant staffing additions, as been recommended through Matrix and some of the other studies that we've done. It would be nice to have, but we also have to deal with the reality of what we have.
I hear you. I hear you. Okay. I got to do some thinking on that.
Yeah. I do it all the time, I understand.
We're with you. We're with you.
Yes, once again, thank you so much for what you do, and I do understand that fire has a mind of its own. I mean, in the perfect world, and I think that's what citizens want. And I understand a discussion about the zoning of like, we want you to say, okay, if it hits here, you go here, but that's not real. Well, life is not that cut and dry. But I was excited about it, and I just would like a little bit more information because Emily had mentioned what was coming out soon, which was that you could text in your zip code, and with that, you would get some sort of information as soon as it was available from the field as to what was going on. So you ran through it so quick that I kind of glommed on and said that to me was something that at least gave somebody some personal, a tool they could use. Once again, I cannot get enough out to the citizenry that there's a personal responsibility and you have got to log in to be a part of Citizen Alert to be notified. But then if there's something beyond that where we could text in and see what was going on and what the next step is, that was exciting to me. So can you explain that a little bit clearer so I could?
Yes, thank you for that, because what the texting in of the keyword does is it allows you to receive any evacuation level alerts that are sent within your zip code zone, regardless of whether or not your home or business location was within the incident itself. Now, what it does not do is give you news updates or scanner type level information feeds. It won't tell you what's going on currently on the ground, unless what's currently going on the ground is an evacuation level alert that I just pushed out. That's the only, and so you'll get evacuation level initial alerts, updates if there are updates, and cancellations when there are cancellations. So it doesn't provide additional information outside of that. All of our agencies and departments have Facebook pages and websites, and we try to work with the media. A lot of people here locally tend to use scanner feeds. There's pros and cons to those as well. But just speaking for my department and the emergency alerting tools that I use, they were never set up to be a news feed. They're just set up to push out life safety information. So we're trying to be more inclusive of the immediately surrounding people, whereas before my training was always, it's best if you can keep your response to an incident small, local, and you don't even bother the neighbors around you, right? So that was my background. That's different now. People want to know, right? And I understand that. So we're adapting the tools, but those are just those things that you will get when you text into those zip codes right now. Just the initial update and cancels of any evac alerts in that area.
But at the same time, basically evac alerts are spaced for safety, and that's what people really want to know is where they are.
Correct. Yeah, and that zip code approach is something that the state is pushing through their state umbrella of the system that they bought called OR Alert. So you may have seen, or the public may have seen press about it, and I'm going to be kind of mirroring that and giving local instructions for local residents here fairly soon so they can do that for our area.
Okay.
And then I don't know that we addressed to all of your jurisdiction questions, Joel, but within city jurisdiction, if you're talking who's lead on evacuation operations, you are lucky enough that you've got your own city law enforcement. Other cities do not. The cities that do not have their own internal law enforcement have to rely on the county sheriff who provides those services. Within the city of Grants Pass, your public safety folks are there, and like they do a lot of times, they coordinate with the sheriff's office for mutual aid or support, but they would have the lead and it would be just the opposite out in the county, outside of the city limits. They could call to City of Grants Pass for mutual aid or support, but Dave would have lead. Excuse me, Sheriff Daniel. Apologies.
All right, Brian, then Vanessa.
Yep, thanks, Emily. Two questions. The first one is on the opt-in system for the OR Alert. Do you have any, or can you tell us how many people have opted into that?
The fun of it is that when you do that, you do it anonymously. So all along, we've been trying to train people to create a Citizen Alert account. I'm sure all of you have created a personal Citizen Alert account. right? Yeah. This new version from the state means you can opt in for a zip code regardless of where you live, and you don't have to have a Citizen Alert account. They don't ask you anything, not your name, your address, just your phone number and your zip code. And that, because of the anonymity of that data, I can't pull that information. Maybe the state could, but right now, I couldn't even pull that up. So I am going to have to, now that the state is pushing that, I am acting as though I have many zip code opt-ins, and I will start alerting, including them in my alerts where I never did before, because I don't know yet if I have 1,000 or if I have 1. So that's where that sits right now, and maybe the state can pull that data for me, but right now I cannot. They are hoping that it will pull more people into the alerting system because people will prefer the anonymity of it. There's pros and cons to that.
Okay, so you're saying for the zip code system, that is not possible, but for the current system, it's also not possible, the way we're doing it right now?
Say that again.
Well, we have the existing system that you use right now, and you're saying that we don't have the data as far as how many people have opted in.
Oh, I can give you opt-ins, yeah, but
Okay.
not using that keyword. That keyword
Oh, that's fine, yeah. No,
just got
what is-
initiated a week ago.
What do we have right now?
Opt-in wise, we jumped 30% since last year, previous to any other year. So we're at about 40,000-ish. However, a number of those are duplicates, so I have to weed out the duplicates. Because you can have duplicate accounts, which we have a lot of, and you can be listed in the 911 database and then be listed as your opt-ins. So we're less, I would say if I cleaned all that out, we're probably less than a third of the total population of the county has an account of some kind within that system.
Okay, so maybe 25,000-ish?
Yeah, and I
Okay.
can get you those numbers. It's a little spreadsheet work.
Yeah, no, I didn't expect you to have an exact number today.
We
but-
looked months ago after the Slater fire, but I haven't looked recently, so I don't know the current.
Okay, and then regarding the difference between temporary zones and permanent zones, I'm just trying to understand, like, if we decided to make permanent zones, there's nothing to say that, you know, given the characteristics of an incident, that we are required to use those zones. If we create permanent zones and there's an incident that doesn't fit with those zones, we can just use the method that we've always used as far as, you know, everyone south of this street or however you guys do it now could still be utilized. Is that right?
I would assume so, but that would be a conversation and a decision that would have to be made with the zoning team. And my assumption is the zoning team would at least be made up with local law enforcement, city jurisdictional, fire, city public works, city GIS, maybe me, maybe some county folks. I don't know how you pull that together, but that's gonna have to be a decision. How are we gonna utilize these, and then let the public know? Because you could have a gas leak, right, that causes an evacuation of just one building. So how do you express that in a larger permanent zone that has 6 neighborhoods in it? So that will have to be a conversation with whatever the zoning team is. I can't decide that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Vanessa.
Thank you, Emily. In May of this year, there was a grant that Emergency Management applied for a multi-phased evacuation planning project. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe the status of that grant?
Sure, I wrote it. Yeah, it was great. It was really good. I have no update on the status of that. That was for hazard mitigation funds. We were told there was a pool of several million still floating out there that was unutilized from the previous year level of disasters, and that they were opening it to broader definitions of hazard mitigation, and evacuation planning was one of those. So I threw our hat at the county level in the ring, and it's slowly making its way through FEMA process. I had more urgent grants that I have checked on. I have not checked on that in months. We did that in the fall, I believe. But I'm happy to do a status check on that. No award letter has come my way yet.
Thank you.
Joel?
So the state has passed a new fire management bill. Does it have anything in it that could help us down here in terms of planning and evacuation? Or do we know?
I mean,
yet?
yeah,
I mean, do we
yeah.
know yet? Maybe we don't know. I mean, there was a lot of funding associated with that.
There's a lot of generalities within that at the moment. They're still working out the details, but I would imagine that there will be some resources and some effort put in that direction. Before I step back, I want to make sure that we got through your question, because I think I left you with some uncertainty. While I don't have a person that I can plan in an office to do the futuring of the incident, that's because I bring them all into the field and we do it at the command post. And so that work is essentially getting done in the field by those of us who are agency administrators and fire managers in the sheriff's office and our law enforcement folks. We do that in the field. Sometimes it's over the hood of a truck, sometimes it's in a church, sometimes it's someplace where we just set up the command post, but we are doing that work. That work is a very big part of how we manage an incident and how we look out to what's going to happen within the next couple hours, the rest of the day, the next couple of days, et cetera.
So that's the command post then that does it, whether it's in the office or in the field, is what I hear you say.
Exactly. Yeah, I pack up my office and I move it with me.
And who makes up the command post?
So at a command post, you'll have the incident commanders for the various agencies that might be involved if it's multi-jurisdiction. So if we're using Cathedral Hills, it could be BLM will be there, ODF will be there, we will certainly be there, Rural Metro will be there because within their protection area, and any other agencies that might have some input into it, but usually we'll have a structural representation as an incident commander and a wildland incident commander, which is usually ODF. They'll unify. We'll form a command post, and then all of our operational decisions and planning on evacuation and sheltering and firefighting effort, and resource distribution and line control, and all of those things are managed in that group at that moment on the incident.
So then, great, that sounds wonderful. So let me go through another scenario then. Cathedral Hills, you have a red flag warning, there's 60-mile-an-hour winds, you're at level 5, resources are scarce. Do you have any, you have your dispatch codes on what you dispatch if something's going to happen in Cathedral Hills. Do you have anything that automatically triggers an evacuation given such events?
No, we'll reserve the right to do that based on what we know at the time of the event, because you don't know where the event's going to occur. You don't know what part of Cathedral Hills, you don't know the direction of fire movement, you don't know what structure is going to be impacted, time of day. All the things, as you and I as fire managers know, will dictate the characteristic and the movement of the incident. We'll take all of that into consideration at the moment.
Sure.
I think everybody wants a sense of security that there's just this magic pen we're going to drop. Everybody will instantaneously be in the information loop, and that there's somebody there sharing this data and we can all make great decisions in a moment in time. Not going to happen. That only happens on TV, it doesn't happen in the real world. My best advice for everyone has been and continues to be, from an evacuation standpoint, you are always ready to evacuate regardless of what the incident is. You are tuned in, you become aware, you opt into the alerting systems and stuff so that you're getting the most current information we can possibly push out. You know you own some responsibility for your risk and taking care of your home, taking care of yourself, your loved ones, and having a plan regardless of what the incident is. And if you think you need to leave, leave. Don't wait for somebody to tell you. Those are often the best ways to go about being self-prepared and preserve your property and your loved ones.
So it seems to me then, like on an ongoing fire where you have an incident command team and they do their fire futuring and for you and your future, and they predict fire behavior, and they give the 3-day warning, the 2-day warning, the 1-day warning. That's all set. We got that down.
Right.
The thing that's a little, I wouldn't call it haphazard, because the command post will handle it, is like what happened in Talent, where your initial attack, it goes immediately from initial attack to evacuation, immediately. And with those extreme weather conditions and maybe even multiple starts, who knows? You know, when you get one start, you're thinking in the back of your mind, well, what we're going to do with this second start.
Absolutely.
I think that's where the concern is in terms of the I mean, if you got 3 days to prepare evacuation routes, you got it down, or if you got 2 days, you got it down. If it takes 8 hours to evacuate a neighborhood, and you have initial attack, and the fire is going to be there in 10 minutes, that's problematic. And I'm not sure there's a solution for that, but we'd like to ensure that that is done in a timely fashion.
We are doing the best we can with the tools and the resources we can, and we'll make those decisions as promptly as possible. The neat thing and the part that inspires me is that we are now really engaging as a community in this conversation, and that there are going to be things we're going to do to improve, and preparedness and awareness, and all of that's outstanding, and that's the work we should be doing.
So, one more question, I'll be quiet. I appreciate you tolerating me, with all due respect to everybody. So, this group that you mentioned that would get together on evacuation, and you mentioned the different jurisdictions that would get together and kind of strategize that ahead of time, would it be worthwhile to not charter that group, but ask that group to meet and get back to us with what they thought and where things are headed? Or has that already been done?
I heard my name, Chief, and I was looking something up, so I apologize, and I do have several thoughts, so.
That's okay. I was partly looking to you because you would be key to any evacuation zone planning that would take place. They were asking if like a coalition of whoever that would be was brought together. Does it make sense to gather the group together pre-planning and make additional recommendations on zoning efforts and routes? Is that what I'm hearing to the council, or?
Well, there would be that, but I'm not all-knowing on that, and you folks are, especially with the different jurisdictions. It might be more than that, depending on what you come up with as a group.
I do have some thoughts. As we kind of tracked through this, and we've been even trying to live with what just happened in our community such a short while ago, sometimes we forget that it even happened. And what I kind of think that will add to this conversation as community leaders like the sheriff and I and city manager and people that are in positions of authority sometimes forget they have the authority to say, let's push the button and make the TV start screaming to evacuate. So there's some of the conversations and some of the dialogue that's been happening. So as we attend ICS 300, 400, et cetera, we become more familiar and less, I'm afraid is not the right word, but reluctance is a great word. And I hate to say this, I'm used to crisis. So if there's a crisis, it's not a concern for me to evacuate a community or to put a school on lockdown or whatever the case may be. But we just have to be a little bit more comfortable making decisions in crisis. And you know what, worst case scenario, we called an evacuation and we didn't need to. So we got to look at that. And the community is asking us for more information than ever before. Information is at our fingertips 24/7. So the old thought process of, well, we don't want to cause a stampede might be yesterday's news.
I had two thoughts. One, I guess my working presumption was y'all would kind of get together and decide with your staff how you wanted to proceed and whether or not you wanted to include me or any other county folks in that, or at least just have an internal huddle up. But my recommendation would be, at least internally, city, public works, GIS, law enforcement, fire, rescue, and then decide from there whether or not it makes sense to just have a pre-planning meeting and then make a commitment towards the project. I don't know. I do want to make sure you understand that permanent zones are a commitment, right? Because you're going to be training people to know their zone and know their routes. And it would be a shame if 2 years from now you're like, forget it, or you like try to change the zones. So it is going to have to have some conversations that everybody's going to feel comfortable. Like, yeah, we can live with these zones for the next 5 years at least, to make it worthwhile. Yeah.
Just wanted to throw in one more thing to help the conversation along too, is that we're a department of leaders and we know that anybody at the lowest level can press the button. So there's not a rank involved in who calls an emergency. It's whoever that individual is in the field that thinks it's necessary, makes it happen. Now, if a supervisor comes in and says, whoa, that's maybe not the best choice, then we'll deal with that at the time. But we've empowered and we have a leadership lead-up philosophy that everybody has the authority to make that happen.
So then with that, Chief, sometimes when you're on initial attack, you're concerned about putting that fire line in, and you're concerned about your firefighters staying alive and not getting burned over. So is there somebody listening to the radio traffic that's saying, hey, maybe that person missed something because of the adrenaline flowing at the time?
So I heard Chief that time, so I figured I better get up here. We're doing that again in the field, Counselor. That's part of the incident management team's responsibility. That's field supervisor's responsibility. And while people may think that we get really focused on the attack and suppressing the fire, which is a very big part of eliminating the problem to begin with, we're also very attuned to what if we're not going to catch it and what do we need to be doing next, and looking out in front of it. I call it opening the map. So a lot of times folks get focused on just what they're dealing with in a neighborhood or a house or a field, and I'm actually opening up the map and thinking, where's this thing going to go next if it gets some wind on it, or if the topography changes, or something occurs that those folks who are heads down and working the lines aren't necessarily paying attention to. And that's part of the whole incident management team's responsibility.
I have a follow-up that I wanted to make to something you brought up. You said, well, what if you live at the end of a road and you've got, it's going to take 8 hours to get everybody out of there bumper to bumper, and you've got 10 minutes. Like, what do you do with that? Well, we do have another program called Firewise over there. We have 2 Firewise coordinators in the county, and one of the services that they do provide is individual home owner level evacuation planning, as well as neighborhood level evacuation planning, if you contact them and participate in their program. So that, just wanted to make sure that folks know that that's a service that exists. I would also, because there may be public listing and it may benefit you as well, if you live on the end of a road like that, I super encourage you to do fuels vegetation management, at least within the immediate 10 feet space. There are a lot of folks who say, I moved to the woods because I don't want to see my neighbor, and I want 100 feet of blackberry brush between me and my neighbors, so I don't have to hear or see them. I understand that. If you can't do major vegetation maintenance on your property, at least focus on that first life safety zone around your home. And then think about working with your neighbors on what's a shelter in place, what's appropriate for shelter in place if you can't get out, if you need to consider that, or creating safety zones within your neighborhood. So that could be one well-maintained, well-groomed, well-watered field that you communally keep and upgraded together that you all can go to, or one cleared, graded area, whatever, right? So there's some additional things that you can do if you find yourself in a higher risk area beyond maybe some of the more day-to-day recommendations. So I just want to put that out there.
Vanessa.
Yeah, I appreciate what you had brought up, Chief Hensman, about having a wider swath of city employees with the ability to activate alerts. It's something that we learned from Talent, that they, with the report that recently came out, that they did not activate those alerts in the ideal fashion. Also, we know with critical incidents that network services are likely to go down. Has there been any discussion between emergency management and network providers of regaining priority for those services at the city or county level?
Yes, that's in place. Yes, those agreements are in place.
Wonderful. And also, we do know that during a critical incident, self-sufficiency is key. You guys have brought that up many times. Personal responsibility is of the utmost importance because emergency responders will be very busy, to put that kindly. So what does an ideal public education campaign look like surrounding this information?
Sure, and these are all just recommendations for you to think about. At minimum, I feel like the public needs to know the purpose of the zone, and you haven't quite decided that yet. Is it right? Is this for fire only? Is it for all hazard? what type of alerting would they receive? What is its purpose? Is there going to be a standard evacuation route map that will be attached to it? So that could be an education piece. And it's the perfect opportunity to say, hey, know your zone, here's your zone. And as part of knowing your zone, here's a reminder of like how to pack an evac kit and how to identify high hazards in your area, and just make a little package that gets promoted at the same time that this product is rolled out whenever that happens. It probably wouldn't be a bad idea to do a reminder on alerting and alert types as well, since they tie in together.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, is there any recommendations that any of you have, Lang, Chief, just regarding what the council can provide for support? Do you need anything from us? Do you have this covered?
I do think we have it covered. I think we can always learn and get better. And we have excellent partnerships. I'm looking at the sheriff right now and Emily. We have outstanding partnerships, and we'll work together to make it even better.
I think one of the things we can do is continue to do our public outreach to get people signed up for the information options available to them, and always do those campaigns about taking responsibility and knowing your zone and that kind of thing. So we'll continue to push that information out also.
Thank you. Joel?
Well, I just had one last thought, and it's for the people that's sitting up here. You know, we went through a budget cutting session, and public safety was our highest priority. And we cut some firefighting positions, and then we see the need for public education, public outreach, keeping dispatchers informed, having adequate resources to respond in a timely manner. And I just want to be careful that we don't, as with some other departments I think we have already, put additional expectations on the same workforce that are already at full capacity. That doesn't work very well. That burns people out. They tend to leave, and you're in a worse situation than what you were before. So I think all of us have that responsibility sitting up here to handle that in a responsible manner, so that we don't do the popular thing or the thing of the moment and then turn around and say, well, but we need, in addition, we got an added workload here. That doesn't work, and that's not the administration's responsibility, that's ours. So I just encourage us to take that seriously.
Vanessa?
Yeah, moving forward, I would like to see permanent routes created for the city and county. Of course, we can only really have control over the city, but I'd like to see that for the county as well, so that they're informed. I'd even like to see the temporary routes that currently exist plugged into our GIS system, so that folks can look online and interact with that map. And I'd like to even see us amplify our public education campaign and learn from what our neighbors have recently done. They even have electronic reader boards with Know Your Zone throughout the city. They have the information on sandwich reader boards as well throughout the community. And they even went as far as holding space at a Saturday market for the rest of the year with a booth, notifying people of emergency alerting systems. So I think those are the things. Oh, also I wanted to plug for emergency management that when there is an emergency call center activated, volunteers are always needed.
Brian?
Yeah, I would just go ahead and second all of the recommendations and ideas that Councilor Auger just said. I'm interested in looking into doing permanent zones specifically for fire. I think Emily discussed, the purpose of, make sure that you have clear purpose for those permanent zones. And then it sounds like the more disasters you try to make permanent zones fit, the less effective they are. So if we have permanent zones that are specifically created for wildfire risk, I think we can really tailor those zones so that they are effective. You know, obviously there's areas of the city that naturally lump together on the perimeter and that are higher at risk. So I would be very interested in having some sort of pre-planning meeting to see what we can do there.
Valerie?
Well, I'm going to go back just to something that I've always believed, being a public school teacher and knowing that schools are kind of a hub for neighborhoods, that, you know, I know right now in COVID it's a crazy time, but having hubs and having neighborhoods kind of come together to talk about the zones, I think that's kind of what public education is, you know, like you said, a blanket zone is only as good as the people who take the time to know the blanket zone. But I just think it's really important that we break it up. I mean, we're in wards. I can go to my ward and kind of focus on my ward and take responsibility for my ward and do that. And I think maybe that's what, like I said, rather than always expecting the staff to take a lead, I think that might be something that as counselors we can do, is take the lead in our ward and just kind of say, where's a place to start the conversation and let people know, and ask at those meetings that we put together if somebody can come and kind of give that information. I do know that there is a site that you can go on right now in Trussville County, because I just recently did to sign up as a volunteer in emergencies, and they will train you. So it's out there. It's just getting people to take the next step of volunteering and being willing to do it. And I think the more you go out to local jurisdictions and to places where people are, you're going to have a better opportunity to get the word out.
Other comments? Brian?
Yeah, I'm glad Valerie mentioned schools, because I think that eventually, if we are able to work well enough together as a city and a county and with the school districts, I really do see the schools being neighborhood shelters essentially for different disasters. And I don't think that that system is in place at this point. I think the school district could probably do a lot to make those sites more prepared for disaster and for taking people in, whether it's making them more fire resistant or making them more resilient as far as backup power goes and things of that nature. But it seems like there's an opportunity there for all of those agencies to work together to have a more distributed response to disaster.
Any other comments?
Mayor, if I may make a quick comment?
Yep.
I just wanted to throw out a thought too. With all the years of experience in this room, it's always surprising that a lot of people only know one way in and one way out of their residence. So there's a lot of education that needs to be pushed out, and we don't want to overwhelm our community either. And just also as a reminder too, when we did go through those budget cuts, we did not cut any firefighters, so there was no firefighters were cut. That was police officers were cut, CSO, and dispatch.
And if I may, can I share a little bit, just a quick thought on permanent zoning? It's really easy to get locked into this permanent zoning because it is the topic of the moment for a lot of communities, especially over in Jackson County, where there's been specifically a lot of interest in it. Too soon yet for us to commit to permanent zoning. There are challenges, as Emily had pointed out, and as your fire guy, I'm not quite comfortable with them yet, especially just blanketly saying, let's go to these permanent zones and this is the way we're going to treat these from a fire standpoint. We have test counties currently in process, and we're talking about information that's coming out of a lot of incidents from across the country. Let's give it a little bit of time. Let's work through some of this and let's see what the recommendations come back out before we commit specifically to any specific system. I also don't want to leave you with the impression that we're not having these conversations. Those of us who are responsible for this topic are talking on a regular basis, and in fact, we've spent a huge amount of time on actual incidents, and I'll point to the sheriff because we've got a great working relationship with him on some of the larger incidents on how to do evacuation and zoning and pre-planning. We've actually set the tone across the state for how to do that. So we are having those conversations, not stepping up and just committing to a system right away and having this information sharing. Don't confuse that with not caring or not being engaged with it. There's still a lot of unknowns, and I'm really hesitant about committing to a permanent system that we expect people to use and we're going to be held accountable for using when the incident itself may dictate something completely different. So let's give this some time. Let's look and watch and see and observe from what's happening with these test communities. That's the whole purpose behind them. And then we'll step into them with due diligence and due regard for what really is going to work for us. But we will need to do that on a timely basis over the next year.
Kurt, did you have something?
Sure. I want to say I really enjoyed this presentation. I think we've had a very good discussion, and I do feel confident that we have the tools and the thought process involved here. But we all know that's half the battle. If it doesn't get out to the people, then it's not going to work. And I would just throw out a suggestion that I think this would be great as a pull-out section in the Courier to explain to everybody what the zones are and what the procedures are, and then print it as a handout that could be distributed around town so that everybody's got something to refer to.
I have Brian, then Valerie.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on what Lang just said about the waiting and seeing on the permanent zones. Obviously, we're not going to have anything set up for this year, but I think you kind of alluded to a timeline of, seeing how it plays out by the end of this year and maybe, making a decision on that next year. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, I think within the next 6 to 9 months, we'll have a better feel for the system's commitment on the state level, and we'll see how it's been employed across the country. And then we'll be able to make a better decision on what we want to do.
Okay, so do you think if we did that in 6 to 9 months that we would have enough lead time to have it ready for next year if we decided to do something like that?
If we decide to do so, yes.
All right, thanks.
Valerie?
Yeah, I was going to respond as well, and I do also support Lang in saying that we're not ready for permanent zones. Number one, Jackson County did, and Deschutes receive a grant, so it kind of goes back to the money part of it. They had finances that we don't have, and that's just a reality of where we're at, and that's how it is. But I still will say, just talking in your neighborhood, just talking in your community, and I call them hubs just because that's who I am, and having a local approach of just talking about, as the people who you live around, and getting out there and saying, what are our options, and talking about it, because I think there's people who know the options just within our neighborhood, and just having that discussion until we get to that point where another decision could be made. But I know there are some people who listen to this and whatever, but I think the reality of it is that we need to look for those opportunities at prime places that we can just bring in community people and have the discussion and talk about, what would you do? What would we do? Where would we go? Because it's going to be very different for me than it is going to be somebody down in the Southeast Ward, somebody in the Southwest Ward. But people that are close to me, we're all going to be in the same boat. So it's kind of like a key time to talk to your neighbors, is what I'm saying. And take that personal responsibility that we all need to take.
It's always a good note. There are anecdotally a lot of people who don't like each other in Josephine County, especially if they're neighbors. But the good news is you don't have to be friends to work really well together in a disaster. So it shouldn't be a barrier. I did want to say, if you weren't aware, many of the schools are certified to be Red Cross shelters and are on the Red Cross shelter list, as well as Redwood Campus. So they are prepared to be that resource. We do hesitate to utilize the schools. We will use them if we need to, but they get asked to do a lot of things for a lot of different people, and there are consequences. If we are utilizing them as a shelter in September, it's going to impact schools and, coming back into session. And so, but yes, they're there. Anything else?
Joel?
Just one quick thing of note. I know about every other year, we use the high school down in the Illinois Valley as an incident command post, and we would pay them for that. And that was funds which they used to finance their school system. They couldn't count on them, obviously, because it was dependent on a wildfire. But those relationships and collaboration benefit everybody. So if the opportunity presents itself, think outside the box a little bit, and it'll be cool. That'll be cool. And the school system will benefit from it. They won't suffer from it.
Anything more on this topic before we move on? No, thank you, Emily. All right, next up, cooling and warming shelters. And Aaron, did you have an intro? Yeah. Okay, Aaron's going to start on that one.
Mine's pretty quick, so. Good afternoon, Mayor, Council. I just have a brief presentation just to get you started and turn it over to Mayor and Council for discussion. It was asked that we have a workshop to have some general discussion on cooling centers. Subject and summary to Council's goals is this does support and enhance community safety and enhance emergency preparedness for our community. So from a cooling center perspective, you got some information, something the county is working on also. There's 3 types of cooling centers that we're talking about. One is an ice station that's more mobile, and it pop-up temporary, provides maybe some misting stations, some water and that kind of thing. There's cooling centers, which has been really the focus of our attention, and those are spaces where individuals may seek an opportunity to get out of the heat and provide shade or air conditioning, water, and an opportunity to get out of that heat advisory warning. And then, of course, there's cooling shelters, which is even a step above and beyond that. It's more complex. It's usually full service with resources, including meals, cot showers, and overnight shelters. And similarly, if you're talking about, and if the conversation continues into warming instead of cooling, it's similar in nature. There's 3 or 4 different types of steps when it comes to warming centers or warming shelters. So Josephine County Public Health Heat Plan employs through the National Weather Service trigger phased activation. Phase 1 is readiness. When the National Weather Service is in a heat advisory, they stand ready and they try to increase awareness of the risks associated with the heat wave that's coming on. Their phase 2 is when the National Weather Service has a heat watch, which is an upper level. It then requests community organizations to conduct preparatory actions for activation, getting everyone involved and prepared that is on a list that will be providing those cooling center type of resources. And then phase 3 is when the National Weather Service has issued a heat warning, and that does usually end in mobilization of a actual center and information distribution to where people can go and locations where they can get out of the heat. So just last weekend, July 29th and 30th, there was a heat advisory, and Josephine County Library District branches were identified, along with Newman United Methodist Church. There was a call out for volunteers. I know Councilor Auger, I think, was instrumental in getting some additional volunteers to help with the Newman United Methodist Church and provide that additional cooling center opportunity, which is always a great resource to have.
It was a heat warning.
Heat warning, okay. Call to action is at council's discretion. Utilize and continue to partner with Josephine County Public Health and Emergency Management in establishing cooling centers during excessive heat warning events. City can take a more active role in establishing cooling centers on city property, and we can try to identify how that would work. And also any kind of policy discussions you might have with warming centers and cold event decision guide. So with that, I turn it over to you for council discussion and deliberation.
Rick and then Joel.
Thank you, Aaron. I know there's a need, especially for the elderly people avoiding the heat and may not have air conditioning. And and it was really nice that the library opened up as well as Newman Methodist Church. Do we have any statistics, how many people used it? If I realize it's still a process of people wherever they're located getting to those facilities, so I didn't know what success we may have had. Thank you.
Back. I checked with public health, and on the first day, I understood that they had 4 folks utilize the cooling center and a cat. I don't know if the cat was separate or included. And then I did not get a confirmation on the numbers for day 2. So that's where I'm at on that.
Joel?
It seemed to me like last time when we went through this at the county, took some leadership, which was a good thing. And then there were some cooling centers that were identified, but they weren't used. And I look at the most vulnerable population, and they're older people that a lot of them probably don't even have cell phones. They're isolated. I just talked to one person the other day through email, and I send out emails. It was through our church, and the only contact he's had since COVID started was my email. And he was thanking me for it, and I thought, good grief. So the most vulnerable population, not only are they most at risk, they're really isolated. And more cooling shelters won't fix that. So I ask what we can do, and with that, I just offer a couple suggestions. One is neighbors are great resources. I know everybody on my block, and we take care of each other. Community organizations, both faith organizations and non-faith organizations, have those segments of population where they can take care of each other. And there's cool buildings. You know, my house is air conditioned for my neighbors, and they know it, and they can come over. But I'm not sure at this point in time, we can feel good about more cooling centers, and probably should, but it's not going to solve the problem, is my feeling. And now I would ask you for your thoughts on that.
Are you just asking the room or somebody in?
Yeah, so,
Emily, you've thought about this more than I have.
So I'm happy to brainstorm with you, but I just want to be clear, I am not the lead on mass care and shelter for the county. That's public health. We don't have any public health folks here, so I'm going to be speaking just from my version, not county public health. I'm thinking of the best way to say this. So I believe we probably are moving towards a trend of more extreme weather events, whatever that might look like, and that we should be better prepared for that. Yes, it's true that even if we had stood up 6 new cooling sites in the city and the county, it's not going to reach everybody. Particularly when they're new and people aren't used to them being operational or used to a consistent location to go to. That's probably solvable over time. I think if this is something you're really interested in pursuing, there's more work to be done with like DHS and Senior and Disability Services and the disaster registry to reach out to folks who are homebound but within your jurisdiction and see, do they need these resources? Do they need support? Even though they will not be able to physically potentially utilize those sites. So there's probably, if you're concerned at trying to broaden your reach to the folks who might be in need, there's probably another tier or two to address. But
yeah, I guess I'm not, the statement was, how do we reach those individuals? And I think we have a certain amount of tools, and we try to utilize the tools as much as possible in partnerships within the community. I've been in contact with RVCOG and their opportunities to open up the senior center to seniors during these events, and they've got their own operational internal issues at the moment and staffing issues at the moment to where they're not prepared to do something like that yet, but they know that it's on the radar, and I've expressed an interest from our level in the community, that be something that they maybe can look at and work towards. And so getting that kind of information out there and with your community partners and trying to increase those opportunities for those specific, like you mentioned, seniors, we're attempting to do that.
Valerie?
Yeah, that was going to be my question, because in all of this, Food and Friends, which is the meal program, I know, my mother for years was on Food and Friends, and they reach a lot of houses, and they are a connection piece to know who some of those isolated people are. So to me, RBCOG and the Food and Friends, and I talked about that with you, is a valuable source, because two things you need to have. You need to have consistency. You need to have, it has to, it's got to be there enough to where they know it's reliable and that it's going to be there. If you go out from, 2 times and then you say, no, we don't need it anymore, then you lack that consistency that will bring more people there. I think transportation there and transit is a huge part of the issue as well. But my first source would be to go to Food and Friends and go to some of those people who do reach those people in the community and say, can you tell us who those people are, so that we can, get them on an alert system or get them to be the first to be notified that there are places available for them. But once again, you come down to volunteers. I know, when I received the mail this last weekend about the heat advisory, I contacted a bunch of people and everybody was like, well, no, I can't do it. I can't do it. I mean, that's part of it, is this whole world that we live in now, that it's harder and harder to get volunteers. And that comes back down to people willing to take that step. And I don't know exactly how to do that.
That is a good thing to note, because you did remind me during some of the earlier extreme heat events, like Meals on Wheels type programs were utilized they were given the information in a flyer, and when they would go deliver the meal, they said, well, if you need this service, or provided a check-in. So that's a coordination piece that probably could be built on. And just as a reminder for transit, they're certainly willing and very community oriented when it comes to any kind of emergency, high or low tier emergency, but they do need to have an agreement in place for transporting folks for this type of need. So that's a conversation that will have to happen, so that unexpectedly they're not getting a call that they're not prepared for.
Joel?
And the last thing I thought of also was, I think the council has done a fairly good job, like with the sprinkle park, with the Caveman Pool opening up this year. I know Judy and I went over during the last day we had at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We went swimming, and there were a bunch of families that were over there. Unfortunately, the ones most at risk don't go swimming. And then the other thing we have is the river, and you want to be careful, because the river can be dangerous, because it can be a cold thing, or it can be too warm, like the Illinois River. They're heavily used also by the population, and it's very effective. Just don't go down to the Illinois, because it's already at capacity. You can even find a park place.
Anybody else? Brian?
Are we asking questions or are we discussing?
Do you have any questions?
I'm not.
Okay, you were the person who raised your hand, so if you're ready to move on to discussion, let's do it.
Sure. I like what Valerie said. I think consistency is key for people to have a center be effective. People need to know where it's at, and it needs to be consistently in the same spot. I also agree with her on, I think the trans piece is huge, because a lot of the people that would need to utilize a cooling center may have difficulty getting a cooling center. So working on some sort of agreement with Josephine County Transit to have that in place and ready to go also be a good thing. And as Emily said, these extreme events are only going to become more frequent, so I don't see the need for this lessening in the future. I see the need increasing in the future, so I want us to try to stay ahead of that.
Vanessa?
Yeah, I'll second that as well. Yeah, as a result of climate change, these events will become more extreme, and it will be consistent annually. So I think getting ahead of it will provide a layer of adaptability to the community. Consistency is key, and Councilor King, you're absolutely right. The Oregon State Medical Examiner recently released their report of the 116 deaths, and a large majority of them were seniors that were isolated from their communities and they weren't checked on. So working with those volunteers and like was mentioned earlier, Meals on Wheels and Food and Friends, I think those are really great resources. I'd even like to see some policy decisions come out of this so that we have some kind of framework that we can bounce off of. I'd like us to have a deciding factor when to activate a cooling site. In our most recent memo from Ellie, there was a couple of recommendations that I would recommend adopting. And I would also like to have that when the National Weather Service does issue a heat warning for our area, that the city will exhaust all networks of communication to the public about such warning. So that could be a press release, a flash alert, social media. Every opportunity that we have, we will take advantage of it.
Other thoughts? Are you all agreeing with these ideas that have been put forward? Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm seeing nods. Mm-hmm. Okay. Valerie, did you have something?
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I agree with it all. It's just a matter of getting the consistency of knowing who's, where they will be located and having and trying to get a reach of the community. Obviously, the Methodist Church stepped to the plate, B Street, and that's wonderful. It would be nice to have someplace on the other side of the river. I mean, it would just nice to reach out to say who might be willing to step up to facilitate those cooling centers, and I don't know how we do that.
Well, I guess what I'm envisioning is having city staff work with public health to figure out where these consistent centers might be, as well as creating a network with some of the Food and Friends and different senior services to just start developing a network of how to contact people. Does that work for now? Rick?
One of the complications I see, we may have the centers available, but we have, if the most risk group out there are seniors, if the seniors have a transportation problem or they are very, I would say reclusive, but just not active in the community, they may not take advantage of the center. And Joel mentioned neighborhood, knowing your neighbors. I wonder if a program like that is even more critical for the success of us, because maybe you don't leave those people in their home, but you go to them and check on them. And if they need to be transported, then you're maybe the person to be able to transport them to the center. But otherwise, I could see the centers not being used to their capacity because these people are being neglected or just not real active in the community. Whereas if we, as neighbors, and knowing our community, would be better checking on them in some way. That's just an idea. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, just the piece that you didn't mention, Mayor, was the transit piece and possibly looking at some sort of agreement with JCT.
Thank you. There may be some more broad benefits, I guess, of developing neighborhood relationships, and some communities do block parties or street, gatherings, different ways of getting people to know their communities. So that may be something you're interested in developing that could help both with this and other issues.
I was just going to ask what the status of our Neighborhood Watch. I mean, we do have a Neighborhood Watch program that functioned for years, and I think it's kind of, where is it? I guess that's my question for the chief.
Yeah, it's in a great place. With the cutting of some staff, we've had to take away the crime prevention piece is no longer there. We're trying to do our best to kind of keep it going, but we still interact with the community. We have the Public Safety Academy every year, and we do vacation house checks, and we do have our volunteer corps available too. And as I'm kind of listening to this conversation too, I do see opportunities for the fraudulent and abuse neglect of our senior citizens that goes unreported all the time. It would be kind of great to integrate a couple of different programs as one, so we could actually prevent some crime as well.
Any other comments? Ready to move on to the next topic? Wildfire Protection Plan.
I just say, can I just insert,
Sure.
sorry, one thing? I had included today an example of the heat index. And I did that because the heat index can be kind of complicated. It was in your decisions guide as a potential trigger point. But I just want to, if you decide to go with that as a trigger point, it's a little more complex to use. You have to go to the National Weather Service site, and you have to parallel the relative humidity with the heat index to, basically you would have to check to see when those are converging. So it's not something that they commonly use. It would be a little more work to utilize as a trigger, but that's an example if you want to look at it.
Thank you. All right, it looks like Lang Johnson's going to take the lead on our wildfire protection plan.
It'll be just a second. The presentation moved on me here. I think I found it. No, that's the wrong one. What was that? I'm not sure where it went. Oh, there it is. Yep, you got it. Thank you. You're welcome. All right, I think we're ready. Before I get started, a couple things. When you guys leave here this afternoon, you'll notice that there's a pretty good column of smoke coming up out of our south-southwest. That is a pretty good sized fire burning in the Salmon River area just outside of Eureka as part of the storm event that we had. So Northern California is burning. I believe they'll probably go into a complex with the number of fires they have down there. So there's a good potential we're going to be back into that heavy smoke pattern into the valley here shortly. So sorry about that. Locally though, the storm event that it came through, there was about 50 reported fires on ODF lands between Jackson and Josephine County. That's not including what happened on the Forest Service, which had their fair share as well. Currently, as we stand now in Josephine County, all of the fires except for 2, from what I heard before I got here, are staffed. The other 2 are being worked by helicopters, and those are down in the Lower Rogue Basin, or Lower Rogue River area. And I know they're working in crews there now. Crews are short at the moment. As you can imagine, the entire region was struck by those storms, and so there's a lot of fires that are currently working. Douglas County in particular is in pretty dire straits at the moment for the number of fires that they had. Where our crews would show up and find anywhere from an individual tree, 1/10 of an acre to maybe 1/2 an acre burning, they were arriving finding 5 and 10 acres burning at a time on their incidents. So a team's been ordered to go into Douglas County to help them in a complex situation to try to manage those incidents. More resources have been requested for the region, but everything's pretty tight. So we are in fire season. And everybody is busy at the moment, and a big shout out to the wildland management agencies as they're working really hard right now to get on top of those to make sure we don't have a larger event. With that, as we move into this presentation, I just wanted to provide you again with a little bit of context to help frame this as I start to share some more specific information that was requested. Keep in mind that what we're talking about here is a community level mobilization. This isn't about an individual division within the city or a couple of city departments getting together and pushing out prevention and types of information or preparation types of information. This is about a holistic approach to a very big problem that's had decades to develop and is going to take time and considerable resources to be able to mitigate, to prevent something, or at least mitigate the degree of damage that can be done for something like Alameda or Paradise, et cetera. So this isn't kind of like a one-trick pony and we're done with this. This is a big, big topic that's going to take a lot of different avenues and approaches to it. And I applaud the council because really a lot of this decision-making is going to be at this level. There has to be a decision made about wanting to do something and then trying to gather enough information and prioritize that and then develop the resources and then the planning schedules to make these things happen over a period of time. And it's going to take a huge amount of leadership and coordination. So keep that in mind as I go through the presentation, because you need to look at it through that lens. You can't think of it as just, here's fire rescue and here's what we're going to do to stop this. That's not this level of conversation. It's much, much bigger. So with that, as a summary, this is a follow-up to our April 26 Wildfire Resiliency Workshop. It was to provide considerations and recommendations on how to create a fire adaptive grants pass. So this is how we can improve our ability to mitigate these incidents. Relationship to council goals is to ensure community safety by developing an urban interface and wildfire resiliency plan. Reviewing the need. So we know under the current wildfire situation, this is an extreme fire seasons are now the norm. We're in the era of mega fires. We're not seeing the smaller fires that would take a little bit of energy and resources, and you could have several of them across the nation or in the region. We're now talking about extremely large fires, and all we have to do is look to Klamath Falls and see the Bootleg Fire. They easily approached 400,000 acres, and it was quite the event. That's nothing new for us. Changing climate, it is becoming hotter and it's drier longer, so our fire seasons are starting to extend and become more significant. Increased hazardous fuel loading, increased development and urban density, so that's the amount of homes and relation that we have in our population to the wildland environment. All landscapes and elevations are at risk now at the same time, so there's fewer resources. It used to be that you'd have the lower elevations come into fire season first, and then as they transitioned out, the upper elevations would still have their snowpack, and it would take time for them to come into their fire season. All elevations now are under a significant fire threat at the same time, which stretches out the limited amount of resources we have to respond. Challenges, we live in a wildfire environment. Fire is part of this ecology. A complex system of land ownership. Fire doesn't recognize land ownership, it doesn't care, we do, especially when it comes to paying for mitigation and for suppression. We have a tendency in society to normalize catastrophic fires. We're becoming okay with them, and that's tough to overcome. The tendency of apathy towards preparedness, this is something that happens to the other guy or happens in other communities. That's always a tough one to overcome. Achieving resiliency is resource and time intensive, and the work is very expensive. So as you remember from the earlier presentation, there were 5 elements to building a fire adaptive community in Grants Pass. We're going to touch on each one of these a little bit more now specifically, and I'm going to give you topics of consideration. So none of these are very intended to be point-specific recommendations other than to give you ideas and areas that we need to consider as we move forward. When I get through with this, then we'll step into some actual recommendations on how to move forward. In review, so development is comprehensive wildfire. This is land use planning, so this is how we develop our community. Community preparedness is the discussion of awareness and education and preparation. Suppression is about how we actually go about suppressing fires. Recovery is the ability to bring the community back after one of these incidents so people can get back into their homes and businesses can get back into the business, doing business. And then fuels management is that landscape approach to how do we mitigate fire's ability to move through our community and cause extreme damage. So starting with development considerations, we can consider expanding wildfire site standards, what we had recently worked on and approved with Fire Marshal Joe Hyatt, to include development within city limits. So not just specific to those high hazard zones, but the entire city. We can take a whole nother look at it. Significant remodels on homes and businesses, UGB development, and standards for sales of homes is just some of the thoughts that we can consider. We can consider a vegetation management program that bans certain high hazard, fire hazard plantings and incentives for removing those that are already in existence. Minimum standards for evacuation transportation infrastructure. So right now, the way we do our development, we really talk about width of streets, those things about moving people in and out under normal considerations, but not a lot of planning goes into development about how do you move people in terms of evacuation. So we do it to a certain degree with subdivisions, but there is a bigger picture here when you're talking about the entire community, and we can give some thoughts into what that looks like and what some of the best practices are now coming out of post-incident disaster that's happened in other areas of the country. Zone approach to development, so we're talking about fire ignition, risk reduction, and strategies. So instead of looking at just a subdivision, now we can look at how subdivisions are in relation to one another in terms of depth of defense. So from the moment you have the wildland interface area where the woods are to the first few development of homes to the greater density, you're talking about the transition of a fire from a wildland incident to where it becomes an urban conflagration where it's going from home to home or building to building. You can put in a defensive barrier that limits the ability of the fire to burn as aggressively or extreme fire behavior and slow its spread and give us opportunities for defense. Where can we make a stand? Where can we slow down its progression? These are big level conversations and planning movements that a lot of communities are just now starting to look at. Establish landscape level wildfire resiliency criteria for all new developments, which goes hand in hand with the zone approach. Develop fuels, treatment, prescriptions, and maintenance requirements. So now we really look at individual properties and whether they want to voluntarily do these sorts of things. Now we can start talking about what is required and then what should those prescriptions look like. Prescriptions is the way we'd actually treat a specific piece of property to make sure it meets some minimum requirements to be self-sustainable and not to spread the fire from property to property. Fireworks was a pretty good conversation here last month. There's more work that can be done there with terms of work with the county to prohibit the use and sale of all fireworks. Just banning fireworks in the city of Grants Pass doesn't work as well when your outlying communities can sell them and use them without any restriction at all. So there's a lot that goes into it. And it's a big subject because there's finances involved with a lot of nonprofit organizations that benefit from those sales. There's civil rights, individual rights, community. It's a big subject and it's not a quick, easy thing to solve. But it needs further discussion. Discontinue burn days and burn windows within the city. Audit all current wildfire mitigation related codes and ordinances for enhancement and compliance improvement strategies. So as we go through our development code and as those subjects come up, we also put an eye to wildfire mitigation factors that may apply to those topics. Review and adopt new recommended national wildfire mitigation codes and ordinances. These are the things that are coming out of other parts of the country from experiences. Some are good, some are bad, but they all need to have some kind of vetting process to evaluate whether we should take advantage of them or not. Consider implementing a Fire Smart Grants Pass campaign. There was some discussion of that here a little bit ago in terms of how could we step up our game for prevention and information. So this is a planned, coordinated, and well-funded awareness and preparedness program and resources to make that work. Right now, most of our programs are very passive and we're not heavily invested in them. There's more that can be done there. Focus on neighborhoods and designated wildfire areas maybe is the priority, and emphasis on home defense, emergency alerting, evacuation planning. All of those things we're talking about being self-resilient and taking ownership. Collaborative with potentially neighborhood watch programs, which we have done in the past, and especially through our FireWise programs. Expand to be all hazard preparedness. That's been a big push within emergency management across the state. So it isn't just about wildfire. All of this has a tendency to apply to any natural hazard that we may face. Task groups to address unhoused fire safety strategies. That's been a topic of conversation, but that needs a higher level of conversation with more stakeholders from around the community and what that means and what should it look like and what can we actually do. Another big topic. Increase firefighter staffing. So we'll move into suppression considerations. So increase firefighter staffing per the matrix recommendation. Participate in state fire marshal incident management teams. This provides great real-world training for fire staff on large incidents in other people's communities, which then we can bring back and apply to how we manage a large incident within our community. Form a wildfire quick response team to staff the City Emergency Operations Center. This team would represent all functions of the city and be responsive to community needs, such as coordinators for evacuation, sheltering, information, volunteers, donations. We can do several of these things now as a normal part of our response, but this is a very dedicated and specific effort as a potential. Incorporate wildfire detection cameras. There's been some conversation and there's some initiatives across the state to do that more. It may be to enhance what's happening with the Oregon Department of Forestry and their system. Regionalization of radio communications infrastructure. So there's a great deal of work and a big project happening in Jackson County now that's costing several millions of dollars. We need to do something very similar to our communication system within Josephine County, and we can take a leadership role in that. Form a CERT, Citizen Emergency Response Team under City Emergency Management. This is a way to tap into community volunteers and help the community become more self-resilient. We have not been as active in promoting this as we could be, mainly because we just don't have the staffing to be able to pick up this much of a program and push it forward. We can consider purchasing a Type 3 wildfire interface engine. This is an engine very specific to structural protection. It's bigger than our brush trucks, but smaller than our Type 1 engines, which are predominantly used for structure fires, and has become the basic tool of trade for interface firefighting now. Consider purchasing a Type 2 wildfire interface initial attack water tender. This allows us to move water into areas that don't necessarily have hydrants, or if the hydrants fail, we have the ability to bring mobile water with us. And when I bring these up, this is our ability to participate more aggressively and effectively with our mutual aid agencies as well, because a lot of them are starting to bring these same resources into their system and can just deploy them within our city if we need them. So it's kind of a reciprocal in nature. Some recovery considerations. So learn from other communities, comprehensive post-fire cleanup plan. We've seen this in some of the larger communities that have been affected by these wildfires. So this is our ability to recover quickly. This is our ability to get people back in their homes and businesses back up and working. So improve our ability to do debris removal, lot restoration, infrastructure recovery, so that's bringing in utilities, etc. Temporary housing and sheltering, so we can keep our residents and businesses here in the area. And then city redevelopment approval process for acceleration. So how do we improve and accelerate the ability for our resident to be able to get the approval to get their house rebuilt in a rapid fashion? So these are things that we're learning from other communities that have been stumbling blocks or have been challenges. We could consider one-stop advocacy for recovery planning and resources. So a resident comes in and they have the ability at one time to meet with folks that would be able to advocate for FEMA, small business, emergency funding, nonprofit support, mental health, animals, any of their needs. We kind of have a one-stop shopping to help them get that done rather than having to go to several different locations at several different times. They have the ability to do that all at once. That goes a long ways to improving your sense of security after you've suffered a disaster, and I think that's something as a community we can certainly be better at. Provide insurance advocacy services for residents and businesses. How do we actually help them through their ability to navigate the insurance industry? Incentives to return and rebuild. So we don't lose the businesses and our residents that are paying taxes and wanting to live and be part of our community. And then plan to rebuild, and this is a big one for me, plan to rebuild with the goal of preventing a repeat incident. So that's when you start looking at your densities and what you're having in your developments for vegetation and the transportation routes and all of those other things that I talked about in development. How do we rebuild with the idea that we don't have to go through that event again? Fuels management consideration. So we can consider a fuels management crew, and I'll go into that here in a little bit more detail. Active seasonal prescription burning on city, private, and adjacent lands. So our wildland management agency partners do this on their lands. I see this as being an effective tool within the city where we can staff up a crew and actually go do these on city-owned lands and private lands and adjacent as needed. We can add to the resource pool. Alternative disposal options, shipping services, cutting and hauling. We can consider fuels and development site assessment projects where this is part of that prescription planning that I talked about earlier, where we can go in and offer those services. We can incorporate 3D imaging, printing technologies for fuel and fire modeling to prioritize target treatments. Grayback Forestry was here a while back and did a presentation with the table in the middle of the floor, and they showed the topography and fire starts and how they moved with fire history. That technology is advanced, and we can do the same thing for the entire community, so we know where to go do our treatments and where to prioritize and get the work done. We can provide incentive funding and subsidies for initial treatment and ongoing maintenance of fuels management within our community. We could consider tax credits for fuel management compliance work, so getting people to actually do the work on their property and then maintain it, and giving some incentive to do that. We can consider holding quarterly partnership meetings with adjacent landowners and management agencies to leverage efforts and opportunities. We do this already through our larger Rogue Valley Fire Plan, but that doesn't mean we couldn't do it more aggressively, be more focused on our specific interest within the city of Grants Pass. So those were a lot of the considerations, so let's step into some recommendations. So one of my first recommendations is that we form a community wildfire resilience steering committee, and this would be a steering committee responsible for planning, development, objectives, priority, funding, and authority. And I see that committee being formed under the council's direction and leadership, because we need to bring in the stakeholder groups from across the entire community. So this could be social services agencies, this can be development, this could be internal city departments, this could be our wildfire management agencies, this could be our development partners, building and trade. Anybody that has a stake in this overall conversation through all of those considerations, we need some level of representation. It also means that this steering group would be the one to determine the levels of services, the scope of the projects, the timing for what we'd like to see on the overall cohesiveness of the work that needs to be done, and then would be responsible for making recommendations on how we're going to pay for it. The next recommendation is a fire-adapted community task group, and this would be the group of the doers. So this would be the fire service agencies and land management agencies, the people who are actually hitting the ground and doing the work, would take the recommendations and the objectives and priorities from the steering committee and actually start to make things happen. This could be a Grants Pass emergency management-led partner group with specific focus on achieving the steering group's objectives. We do a lot of this already and have systems in place through our Rogue Valley Fire Plan, and a lot of these relationships are established. We just need to give them the resources to actually go out and get the work done. This could be on-the-ground fuels management, public education, prevention, preparedness, fire-wise, alerting, evacuation. We could look at starting a fire-adapted Grants Pass program. This transitions the current grant-funded Grants Pass Firewise coordinator through emergency management, county emergency management, to a permanently funded position within the city, and retitle him as a fire-adapted Grants Pass coordinator, so very specific to our mission, our scope, our work. Continue the Firewise programs as we are doing now. Incorporate all hazard preparedness and prevention education into the messaging. We can work on emergency alerting and evacuation, as we discussed earlier, and now we have a place to house it and for the work to be done. In collaboration with public safety prevention and emergency management, we can leverage our relationships and partnerships. We could look at a city fuels management team. So a fuels mitigation on city, public, and private lands with priority given to reducing the threat of extreme wildfire in the city. So initially, we would want to treat the lands within the city of Grants Pass that would be under our direct supervision and responsibility. But wildfire doesn't necessarily just focus on that. We need to be able to do that in partnership with adjacent landowners, whether it be public or private. So we're building a buffer. 5 to 6 full-time employees with a program coordinator, which could be the Firewise position. Trained to run power equipment, develop fuels reduction prescriptions, use of fire and mechanical mitigation, wildfire qualified, so they could actually be deployed, especially like times right now. Contract, could be a contract with a private fuels management vendor like Grayback. Could consider a joint effort with BLM, county, private landowners for the maintenance of our large acreage threats like Dollar Mountain, Cathedral Hills, Beacon Hill, College Heights, just to name a few. So there's a lot of work to be done. City-sponsored fuels work on city-owned properties. We'll share a little bit here in a minute about acreage that we could be looking at to treat initially. Provide fuels management subsidy to homeowners at no cost or sliding scale depending on ability to pay. And we'll talk about that some more here in a minute. make crew available to other public partners at a competitive market rate, so we could subsidize the crew by actually loaning them out to get work done in those areas outside city limits. Determine how to leverage available grant funding to subsidize fuel programs. And I think I mentioned before, grant funding is out there, but the tendency is they want to give that grant funding and significant amounts of it that's sustainable to well-established programs that are showing a legacy and they're here to stay and that the community is heavily invested in. Trying to find that funding and do a startup and then to move it forward can be really difficult to do in the long run. So cost implication, and these are estimates only and they are broad strokes. But I know that there was some general discussion before I made the presentation that folks would like to know some ideas about numbers. So keep these numbers general, and we'll talk about them a little bit more, but it's really to give you some sense of the scope of costs that we're potentially talking about. So a comprehensive Fire Smart Grants Pass program could be $50,000 to $75,000 a year. And then if we decided to do some kind of subsidy for doing fuels mitigation work, that might be the place you need to house it, and that number would need to go up if we decided to fund it. City Firewise Coordinator, non-supervisory, so this is the person that's just going to be our Firewise Coordinator, being our person that's going to run our fire adaptive program with no supervisory responsibilities. It'll be about $114,000 a year. Fuels management. So pending vegetation density is a big key here. So every acreage that you see cannot be weighed the same. You have to base it on the amount of fuels work that needs to be done in order to make that property safe. So a grass field is going to be a completely different subject than somebody who's on a very heavily brushed and wooded lot. What we're talking about here is cut, piled, burned, and chipped, so that we're not only just removing the vegetation, but we're also disposing of it. And the crew needs to be trained to be able to do all of those operations. Commercially right now, the rate's anywhere from $700 to $2,000 per acre. So for this conversation, let's just say that an average city lot's $700, and this is one of your wooded lots that's going to be in our interface area. Plan on retreating every 3 years, so that could be anywhere from a third to half the cost. That number can go down based on whether the property owner actually does maintenance work from year to year to year rather than waiting the 3 years to do the work. Estimated about 1,100 acres total in designated high fire or high hazard areas. So these are the areas that we've already designated in the city as high hazard. This isn't adjacent, moderate hazard, or lands that are outside these areas. These are just the high hazard. So keep that in mind as we move forward on the conversation, because there's quite a bit more land out there that needs to be treated. So if you take that 1,100 acres and then you use the $700 per acre and the $2,000 per acre, then that gives you that broad range between 800,000 upwards of 2 million. That doesn't mean that's what it's actually going to cost, because there's a lot of factors that go into it, but that gives you a scope of the range of potentiality. This does not include Dollar Mountain, UGB, or adjacent acreage, like I said before. Of that 1,100 acres, about 60 acres of it is city-owned, about 45 acres is commercial, and the predominant amount is about 900 acres in residential. So that's just within those hazard zones. And this really is a good segue into why hasn't more of this work been done in a regional level or on a state level? And you can see now that the numbers can be a bit frightening. There is a huge amount of work that needs to be done on these untreated lands or properties, and it's not cheap. Cost for a fuels crew, so a commercial estimate right now is the rate is about $50 per person hitting the ground, ready to work. That's trained and equipped. So you're looking at about $500,000 per year, plus the acreage profit margin. That doesn't include the acreage profit margin. This is just to field the crew to get the work done. Gross city estimate rates for a fire adaptive community coordinator plus a 5-person crew. The adaptive coordinator is going to run us about $127,000 a year. Full-time crew firefighters is about $500,000. Startup equipment's about $200,000 annually. It's going to about $50,000. Total startup is about $850,000 with an annual running of about $700,000. We've been at this a while today, so I'm drying out. Sorry. Keep in mind that these are numbers if we funded and did all the work. With the city rate estimate, that is, we're not actually charging anybody to go do the fuels treatment. This is us fielding a crew to go out and do fuels treatment. If you were to use a sliding scale, a subsidy where the property owner shared cost, then that number goes down. Thank you. That number goes down. As you can see, that is potential revenue coming in to help subsidize the program, or we are using the crew to go out and do work for the wildland management agencies in partnership. So there's other ways to bring revenue to this rather than just footing the bill. So in summary, that was a lot of stuff. This is a big community-based project. The effort will be expensive. Resources and support are available out there, and there's ways to reduce the impact both financially and to the community as a whole. The work and change is necessary at the community and a landscape level, and it is doable. There's years of committed leadership and community dedication required, but it's important to know that the work will make a difference. So a call to action is council discretion. Some alternatives to stay the current course with no immediate changes. Additional workshops to further explore options. Consider third-party services. Combination of alternatives. And with that, I am open for questions and more conversation.
Thank you. Joel?
Good presentation, thank you. One of the things, have you considered, and it looks like you had it down there for the options and alternatives, as we move forward, generally the risk isn't high in the wintertime, and you generally do fuels abatement, I guess, in the wintertime. And then there's different fire seasons. So sometimes there's an extreme fire season. It's not a steady state thing. One of the things that I realized, if you ever drove over to Bear Camp and went up Burt Ridge used to be goat range with no trees at all. Mm-hmm. And there was catastrophic fires that Sir Francis Drake saw smoke from 10 miles out in the ocean all summer long. So this is nothing new, but it's episodic. It's not steady state. It doesn't happen every year for the last 300 years. But on the average here in the valley, it would burn about every 5 to 20 years. And if you look at the last 100 years, we got 5 times as much fuel out there as what we would normally have pre-European settlement. Given that, it seems to me, what would you think of having your permanent staff, but then having a contract engine only during, at least starting out, only during high fire season and during the summer months when you need it as a contract engine, that would also do fuels reduction work during that time on the shoulder or off the shoulder. One of the things that strikes me is Oregon's going to have a lot of funding available. We want to get ahead of the power curve. We want to get organized because there's going to be money available. If we don't set ourselves up to take advantage of that, it's not a good thing. So I was thinking of an intermediate thing rather than risking going in full-time, year-round with permanent employees of hiring the full staff, doing a contract crew during the high-risk months. That could also do, like with the grayback, has to have a grayback engine, available for that person to supervise. What would you think of something like that?
I think those are all legitimate considerations that the steering group would need to take a look at.
And have the state of Oregon funded through the recent legislation once we read the fine print.
There's always fine print.
Do we have questions? Rick?
Thank you, Lang. You mentioned home defense, and I realized the building code for a while there has always been trying to introduce internal sprinklers. Would external sprinklers on rooftops give a significant advantage for a home to withstand a fire, or because fire is so, I would say temperamental but unpredictable, it may not be that effective?
There is quite a bit of work and study still going on today about defensive measures for individual homes using sprinklers or gels, pre-treatment, wrapping your house. I think all of those are on the table to be considered. My personal experience has been that the best defended home is the one that's built correctly to begin with and is not ignition ready to start with. Any of those other types of activities, you're kind of relying on the water system working, you're relying on backup pumps, you're relying on plumbing, you're relying on a lot of different things where if you build your house the right way and you landscape appropriately, then your survivability goes up significantly without a whole lot of depending on other systems. But all of that should be on the table.
Also, you mentioned possibly for the city actually owning its own water truck. Do we have a system in place now where we can call on commercial water truck people and ask them to assist and locate in certain locations where they might be needed?
So that is a sticky wicket that you get into, because when you hire them, then you're hiring their equipment at unknown status of that equipment, and then you can end up buying their problems. So if the engine goes out, the brakes go out, the tank leaks, those sorts of things. So we have a tendency not to do that, but there are systems in place to do it. We don't specifically do that with fire rescue now. The other thing is you're talking about fire equipment that has high liability attached to it. So if it fails during a firefight, we can be held liable for its failure and the loss that results from that. And then you're also talking about the life safety of our firefighters. So that's why we have our own equipment and why we try to employ it and take care of it and maintain it. So there's a lot of things that go into those factors that we have to consider, but they're all open and on the table for discussion.
Other questions? Valerie?
I don't know if I have a question. I'm kind of going back because this is a lot of information, and obviously a lot of information, a lot of money. I mean, two things, and we just went through a $2 million cut. And so, you know, it would be wonderful to have all of this, but it's not going to happen overnight. So I just kind of want to go back to asking you whether your first recommendation would be to build a community wildfire resiliency steering committee, because you kind of have to start somewhere. And I guess that's what I'm saying, is that, you know, I look at this and I look, you know, 6 months ago where we were at, and I also, which is why we didn't cut firefighters, is because we knew fire season was coming, and we knew that in our heart this would be a big issue down the road, which is here we are. So my question to you is that your recommendation right here is to get started by building a wildfire resiliency steering committee to start helping us make these decisions and start prioritizing, because there's no way we could do that. We're going to need expertise to help us get there. So is that
Yes.
basically what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Brian, then Joel?
I'm good. Go ahead, Joel.
So the other thing I wonder if it's a possibility, I agree with Val, and it was a great suggestion, that we look at that, because it is a priority for our people and the future, and these episodic events that occur, they can be very serious. In our partners, relationships precede substance, and relationships prevent scarcity, or can overcome scarcity. And so the interdepartmental relationships we have with your fire partners is very important and very key. Part of that is both the state and the federal sign up private resources ahead of time with inspections.
Correct.
And I was wondering if there's some way we could tie into that where the liability is associated with the operator, like it is, and they've already signed up, they've been inspected, they've been accepted, and they're available for you to call on them when needed. And I wouldn't say they're unlimited, but during this time, they're very hard to get. But at least you have a chance. And I don't know if that kind of relationship can be built to tie into that existing system and save us money.
Chances are they're already bringing them to the table. during the fire event.
Right,
If we're
right.
talking about the mitigation work, then entering into a contractual agreement with one of the established private providers that are already out there, like Grayback, and there were several others,
Sure.
where they know that they have an invested partner that's willing to support and sustain them, then their willingness to provide those resources goes up significantly. So we're probably better off going to the individual providers than we are trying to do a mutual assistance or compact with an established system, because it's really not call when needed for a fire event. We're looking at the mitigation work, and those agencies are already established and those contracts are already out there to be able to do that.
Sure, sure. Okay. I know there was a lot of resistance to going to private with all the agencies, and a combination of contracting and employees worked really well.
Yeah.
And it was kind of threatening to the employees at first, but then they got used to it and they actually liked it.
And we'll need to take that in consideration with any conversation we do there, because we do have employment
Sure, sure, and
contractual agreements with our firefighters and not privatizing their work, and there's lots of those hoops that we'll have to jump. But I think depending on how you set this up and what the intent of the work is and the scope of that work, there's other ways to do this and make everybody happy.
well, the last this is a comment, so you can call me on it, but I love you guys and what you do, so.
Thank you.
Vanessa?
On slide 5, there's a development consideration for standards for sale of homes. Can you elaborate on that?
We've seen some communities where they're looking for a way to leverage property owners to actually take advantage and do something with the property. This would be a great example. So before you sell your home, you have to make sure there's smoke detectors in the house and that they have to have carbon monoxide detectors. Before you sell your house, you got to make sure that your fuels mitigation work's done and you meet the prescription as required by code, would be an example.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right. Thank
And
you.
as you can tell, there's a lot of really loaded recommendations and considerations in there. That's why I made the recommendation for establishing that committee, because it's a broad width. This is community-based. This isn't just a little bit of impact to a few stakeholders. This can impact a lot of stakeholders.
Thank you. Council, did you want to discuss this? Vanessa, then Valerie?
Yeah, I hope everyone was able to take a glance at this photo that was handed out. Did you get a copy of this, Lang? Okay. This is what I was hoping to see, and this is what you brought forward, so thank you very much for that. I was really hoping to see a holistic response to this issue, so I'm happy to see this presentation today. And I know, you know, finances are always going to be a problem, unfortunately, so we really have to quantify the costs of action versus inaction. And there are some recommendations in here that would only cost staff time, so I think that those are worth considering first and foremost. Of course, it's important also to prioritize the recommendations that were given today, and this is where I see that Community Wildfire Resiliency Steering Committee coming into place. And I think that we do have a really strong responsibility to move forward on that committee, because the study, the Oregon Department of Forestry study that came out of the top 25 highest burn probabilities in the state of Oregon, our county is 7 of those. So I think that we do have a really high responsibility to move forward on that steering committee.
Valerie?
Yeah, my recommendation was the same. I mean, like you said, there's a lot of stuff in here, and really we need to start something, because as Vanessa said, we know we're one of the most fire-prone in the state, and we do have a lot of pieces and parts. I mean, you know, as we go through this, we do have a lot of pieces and parts, and we do have a very proactive, you know, fire safety. We have FireWise. We're doing what we can. So I also promote that we get right on it, and that we do develop a community wildfire resiliency steering committee and get it moving as fast as we can and bring on the stakeholders that are involved. So that would be my recommendation as well.
Brian?
I wanted to thank Chief Johnson for putting together such a comprehensive presentation on this topic. There's way more in here than I could have even imagined was possible. So I appreciate the thoroughness and the diligence that he and his staff put into this presentation. And I want us to take it seriously. I want us to start this steering committee. And I also want the chief to let us know if there's anything in these recommendations that is of a more imminent nature that are things we should be doing right now, as opposed to forming a committee and having things go through the committee and then having things come out. If there's anything that really jumps out that needs to be addressed like yesterday, please let us know.
I appreciate that. The recommendations based on this is a long-standing problem that has gone on for decades. It's going to take good, diligent steering to move us out of it. And so there's no immediate, fast, quick answers. It's good due diligence and good work and decisive decision-making moving forward that's going to make the difference with commitment for the long term.
Thank you.
Joel?
Well, I would also ask the chief if during this high fire time, and it's going to start declining because the days are getting shorter and the temperature's going down and the sun's getting lower in the sky, but we have what we call severity forces. So when the fire danger goes up, you supplement your forces with a contract engine. And that would take an expenditure that would have to be approved by the council, I would assume. But if during the high fire danger we have that, we maybe would need a supplemental initial attack fire engine that the council would have to approve and fund. And just to consider that, to supplement your resources, just like the other agencies do. They bring in additional resources when they anticipate these events. Because if you wait till the second day to get the engine, sometimes it's too late.
Other comments? Rob?
So I guess I'm asking the council and the staff, so what do we have to do to get a steering committee or a task force going as soon as possible? Because we know this is going to be, as Lang says, it's potentially years, but what do we have to do to make this, to take the first step immediately?
You could direct us to go ahead and start that process, and what we do is we would put together a mission, a call to action, suggested memberships, bring suggested memberships to you for you to actually create a business meeting and potentially at that same time appoint those individuals, and we'd get the ball rolling.
Yeah, then thank you. I'd like to, I don't know if making a motion is the correct thing at this time, but I'd like to, I guess, make a motion that we give staff direction to get this started ASAP.
With a second from DJ. Discussion on the motion? Joel? Oh, DJ seconded it already. Okay, no discussion. I guess go ahead and let's vote. The motion was to create a steering committee. Rob?
Yes.
Brian?
Yes.
DJ?
Yes.
Kurt?
Yes.
Valerie? Yes. Joel?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Vanessa?
Yes.
All right. Looks like we're in agreement on that one. Any other discussion on this for now? Nope. Okay. That's where we'll get started then with that steering committee. Do you guys need a break or plow through? No. 5-minute break. Come back at 2:06. Buddy, we still have a couple things on the agenda that we need to get through today, so Aaron is ready to get us restarted here with the creation of a parking enforcement job classification.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. It's my pleasure to talk to you about the creation of a parking enforcement officer. Relationship to council goals. This does support council's goal leadership by ensuring the efficiency and effectiveness of city operations are there and appropriate for enforcement of downtown central business district and other city locations for parking enforcement. So just a brief background of why we're talking about this today. Back in 2020, City did conduct a downtown parking survey to determine business owners' concerns and desires related to parking and parking enforcement in the downtown Grants Pass area, and parking enforcement was one of those items that came up. In 2020 also, an executive summary of the Downtown Parking Task Force was provided to council. One item was to have dedicated staff providing consistency enforcement. That was one of the issues that was determined as something that needed improvement, is consistent parking enforcement. So at the time, council directed staff to go ahead and publish a request for proposal for contracted parking enforcement. We did that and received a couple of responses. And on May 19th, 21, council considered Republic Parking, which was the lead response to the proposals. And council ultimately decided not to pursue contract services and expressed an interest for the city to do it in-house. So that's sort of why we're here today, is to talking about how we're going to do, if you want to do and continue to go through this process, have consistent parking enforcement. In order to have consistent parking enforcement, if we're not going to do it through a third party and to do it internally, we really should develop a parking enforcement officer position. The responsibilities of this position would be to proactively patrol on foot or by vehicle to ensure compliance with parking regulations, to mark the vehicles and record the times through that process, to write warnings and citations, respond to parking complaints, provide traffic control, observe and report hazardous conditions, be an extra set of eyes out there in the downtown area or where they're doing parking enforcement, and investigate and respond to complaints regarding contested parking citations. Those would be the primary functions of this one position. So parking enforcement officer, the creation of that, to create a full-time employee and parking enforcement officer position. The expenditures we have budgeted to date in fiscal year 22 is we do have money set aside, which is $94,000. That was set aside originally for the contract services, doing it through a third party. So that money is still there and allocated for parking enforcement. In determining what a parking enforcement officer salary would be and what we'd be looking at from a cost perspective, we did do research in out to 11 comparably sized cities in the state of Oregon. We did find 3 cities that have parking enforcement officers, and their salaries are below on that chart. With Grants Pass taking around the average, we'd be looking at $3,081 per month up to $3,933 per month for step 6. So I figured this question would come up, so I'd bring it up. We currently are doing some parking enforcement with community service officers, and just as a comparison, a community service officer salary all in is about $84,000 per year, where a parking enforcement officer would be around $72,300, which would be a savings of about $12,000 per year for dedicated parking enforcement. What we're doing here is based on council direction of looking at doing parking enforcement in-house. We're asking for the approval and the creation of a parking enforcement officer position and to amend the classification plan at the August 18th, 2021 council meeting. You could also, though, if you want to continue to do and look at parking enforcement and consistent parking enforcement, go out for a new RFP for parking enforcement services, or you cannot approve the new position classification and continue the use of community service officers as availability allows for parking enforcement duties. And with that, Mayor, I turn it over for questions.
Thank you. What questions do we have? Rob, Joel, Rick?
Okay, first I'd like to say that this is an excellent idea. Without this potential position being filled in some form, I have absolutely no confidence that parking will be enforced well downtown. I just haven't seen it. In the 25 years I've been paying attention to it, we've had at least 3 police chiefs who are well-meaning and want to do the job that way, and it just always ends up the same thing, is that the CSOs get pulled off to do other things. Even if we go a year or 2 where it's working great, we go 2 or 3 where it's working terrible. And that's just been the reality for 25 years. So I think that this is generally a really good idea. And since we decided not to do the Republic deal, something like this I think is really needed. But the questions I have, first off, the number one thing is, even though they are called a parking enforcement officer, are there situations, can and will they be pulled off to do other things, just like CSOs are now? In other words, is it going to be different, or are we going to have the same problems that we have now?
Great question, Counselor, and I think it's important for us to make sure that and some of those main job responsibilities were on a previous slide, but the parking enforcement officer is just that. It is for parking enforcement. And where a CSO has a multitude and a wide variety and breadth of responsibilities, so they may go out and respond to accidents and do those kind of things. This is something the parking enforcement officer might visually see something, might be able to assist if it's in that parking zone area, but ultimately that would be a CSO or a police officer would call in. This is dedicated parking enforcement. That's their responsibility.
Great, and because that's what it needs to be, in my opinion. So another issue that I'd seen before, and again, it was at a time when the funding was right and the chief at the time was well-meaning. If you've got one person, we'll say, who has this job, what happens if that person gets injured? And as silly as that question may sound, we had a situation years ago where the CSO, who was basically, at least in my part of the downtown, got pregnant. And she spent her last 3 months, or last trimester, behind a desk at City Hall, and we had no parking enforcement. So the city couldn't get rid of her, and they didn't have the money to replace her, so we had no enforcement, and then she went on leave, et cetera. So what happens in that situation if we basically have one person, and that person, obviously we don't expect it to be perfect every day, and there's sick days and everything else, but what happens in that situation? Person gets pregnant, leaves it for a few months, or injured or whatever.
That's another great question. So in that situation, it wouldn't be a totally perfect response, but what we would do is with that, if say there was an extended leave of absence due to whatever that is, we would need to try to utilize the CSO staff bandwidth to subsidize that until that individual's back. Running a lean system with just one parking enforcement officer doesn't provide for that double coverage, and I don't think we believe it's necessary. We're not coming to you with thinking we need 2 FTE, but in those unique situations where there might be an extended leave or someone goes on vacation for 2 weeks, what we would do is we would be filling that vacancy with a CSO trying to be dedicated for that purpose during that window of vacancy.
Joel, I have Joel, then Rick, then Vanessa, then DJ.
One of the things I'm used to is a multi-skilled workforce that, and I know you run the city that way because you do a very fine job of that, and I know the public safety unit does that as well. So you showed up there the CSO versus the public parking attendant, and as I agree with everything that my fellow councilor Rob said, and I think it's a good plan. The question that came to my mind is, so you have a CSO that's dedicated to parking, what does the $11,000 extra buy you? What is the marginal benefit of that marginal cost? And if we did that, would that CSO still be dedicated to parking as the parking attendant would be?
So it's a good question. The marginal benefit, I think, is the question of what extra services does a CSO provide. But the topic today is the marginal benefit, the benefit of having dedicated, consistent parking enforcement. So from that standpoint, if we went and we hired a CSO, the system in place is that CSO needs to be focused on highest and most in best need. And there's so many things that a CSO is focused on that we may say this CSO position is dedicated or trying to dedicate parking enforcement. As Councilor Pell said, we've tried in the past to do that. And the fact is, our public safety department is extremely busy. Our police officers are running from the first minute they're in that vehicle until the last minute they're in the vehicle. And it is with the CSOs also. There's so much activity that the likelihood that the CSO is going to be pulled from parking enforcement, because parking enforcement is not as high on the list of responses as other responsibilities the CSO has, we will have a reduction in a non-consistent parking enforcement.
Rick?
Thank you, Aaron. I have 3 questions. We have cadets now. Are they able, and are they currently doing any parking enforcement?
No, they're not. They're not doing any parking enforcement.
The cadets are there for an extra set of eyes and ears to help get information to the appropriate individuals within the public safety system and to be that sight and visibility thing. So that's not their responsibility or task.
Could we reassign their responsibility if that were, we chose to do so? How does that work?
We could, yeah, absolutely. I think ultimately, if we're trying to identify, yes, we hire somebody to do parking management 100% of the time, and then that person takes an extended leave of absence, we've always rallied and we're able to figure out how to at least provide some sort of a service to get us through the difficult period of time. Our cadets can issue parking citations. They can enforce it along with CSOs. And if this was approved and we did hire somebody just to do parking, we would supplement that if needed.
Okay. And then would this position include additional equipment such as like a license plate reader or computers or other sophisticated equipment?
That answer is no. We have already been working toward a Brazos ticketing system, the handheld ticketing system. So we're just figuring out the kinks with finance and interacting with Munis and our current systems. That's already purchased. It's like $3,300 a year for that service. So we've already figured that out, and we would just work with the tools that we currently have to put that person downtown.
Okay, thank you. And last question, do we have an estimated income that the tickets, issuing the tickets would produce to help compensate for that position?
Well, I think you could look at a broad range of that, and it all depends on that consistent enforcement. Looking back at 2019, I think we brought in around $16,000. That's with not consistent enforcement. When we were talking about potential revenue streams with consistent enforcement, when you were looking at a third party bringing it in, you're looking at it potentially covering the whole cost of the contract and the cost of that. So I don't have a good number for you on what consistent enforcement would bring in. I can tell you that we're averaging around $15,000 to $18,000 a year.
Okay, thank you.
Vanessa, then DJ.
Is this a sworn or a non-sworn position?
Non-sworn.
Thank you.
DJ?
So that might have helped answer my first question. The authority that a parking enforcement officer would have would be similar to a CSO or cadet?
Yeah, absolutely. It would be much less than a CSO.
Okay. So similar to a cadet or, you know, radio capability, those kind of different things, but.
Yeah, very basic, eyes and
Sure.
ears. Their sole purpose would be writing parking tickets, period.
Understood. So we need to have an adequate parking enforcement in this community. So my question would be, I guess, the adequacy of that service. Is it fair to say that, you know, a total time spent currently on parking enforcement is 1 FTE from your CSOs? My concern is going down this route of getting 1 parking enforcement officer, and then we experience that that's not quite adequate, and then we'd have to supplement that sooner than we would expect.
I think that's going to be to be determined. When we did the RFP, Republic Parking did suggest that they may be able to write, or they anticipated writing 5,000 to 7,000 citations. Yeah, the potential revenue, I'm looking at it right here. So that's what their guesstimate was, I guess you could call it that. I'm confident that if you put somebody down there full-time, we're going to get a lot of parking tickets, which will probably generate a lot of parking ticket complaints. But we're going to get, you're going to see almost, you're going to see a significant increase overnight, there's no doubt about it.
Sure. Yeah, my question, I'm not concerned about revenues at all with parking tickets, just about having adequate enforcement and, you know, the community feeling that, hey, there's a fair share out there of parking. So is it fair to presume that one FTE at this point is going to be adequate?
I think where we're at right now, that's absolutely fair, and that's where we should at least begin with and then reevaluate it later.
Sure, thanks.
Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I just had a question about the cost comparisons. There's three categories. There's the salary, there's the benefits, and then there's a third line of health and welfare benefits. And I see that those numbers are the same for a CSO or for a parking enforcement officer. One more slide, or keep going.
Right.
It's the next to last slide.
Number 6.
Yep. So that third line item, health and welfare benefits, I was just curious if you could briefly explain what that is.
Most of that is health insurance, which every employee that the city pays its portion of health insurance for. It's the same plan, so that doesn't fluctuate from employee to employee. I think there's another very small portion, maybe like $150 in there as well, but the rest of it is health insurance.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right, we're questioned out.
Thank you.
Discussion on this topic. We need to provide some sort of direction on where we're headed. Brian, Rob, Valerie, DJ.
I am fully in support of creating this one FTE. I think it could help us bring in revenue and increase parking tickets to help pay for the position, as well as something that we haven't talked about yet is, and I don't know if this position would be involved or not, but I think somehow the city should put a little bit more effort into selling parking passes. I know we do have a parking pass program. I don't know how well it's utilized, but I think that, you know, it's part of the same conversation. We can, you know, increase revenue from tickets and from increased parking pass sales. So I'm in support.
Rob?
Yeah, to DJ's point earlier, it's quite possible that if the revenue coming in is anything close to what had been predicted by Republic, that if we needed more, and you need another half-time position or whatever, we could easily afford it. So that's, it's possible that the revenue generated. But the other point that I want to make that we haven't made today, and it's kind of unspoken, but just to speak it, so it's very clear, is that the reason that we're doing this is to benefit businesses, is to make it so that customers know they're more likely to find an empty parking space close to their favorite business because there's nobody in the spot for 6 or 8 hours a day that the spots are turning over. And that's the whole goal here, and consistent enforcement is I believe, the only way to do that. So I think that that's the way to make that happen. It's business friendly, it's customer friendly, and from all that I've seen, it's probably the most practical way to make that happen.
Valerie, I see you, Joel.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. I mean, we've had this conversation. We went the route of the RFP. The council didn't want that, but we've said all along that we want consistency, and I thank you for putting together this position because I think it's the step that we need to take to have the consistency. It's the first step in knowing what works. And so I'm going to go ahead and make a motion, because we can do that, and I figured that out after the last time, that says let's go ahead and do this. Let's create the city position, parking enforcement officer, and move on.
Did you just create a motion?
I did create a motion.
Okay, and Joel, are you with the second there? Okay. So further discussion, we have DJ and then Joel.
Was a motion to
Create the
Create the
position.
forward? Okay. Yeah, I'm supporting that motion, but I'd like you to maybe come back with us 9, 10, 12 months, something like that. Let us know how it's going. Just give us some metrics. Do we need to supplement the program? Where are we going to find the money? I think the sooner we know, the better. So that would be an ask. If you recall, Rob, we had an idea in the Downtown Parking Task Force to have sort of a longitudinal parking study, that we have merchant input and otherwise, or community input about, you know, parking availability downtown over a period of time. I think it might be a good time to do something like that in concert with having a parking enforcement officer, so that we can get an idea of, you know, how it's doing, those kind of different things. If we could pull that off, I think it would be good timing.
Joel?
Well, I support it, and the other thing that I caution against in my own thinking is having blinders on to think this is just about parking. What it's going to do is it's going to free up resources that are presently doing that job to do what I would consider even higher priority. And it's not that we don't support the businesses, but we'll have that CSO that's presently doing some downtown parking help respond to accidents, help respond to people that are hurt. You know, the fire evacuations, those type of things. And so it's going to free up a little bit more of those resources for those other public safety values that we would like from our public safety officers. So also I'm going to support it.
Any further discussion on the motion? Rob?
Yeah, there's just one other thing that I'd like to make clear too, as this word gets out to the public on this. When we did surveys, the task force did a survey, parking task force did a survey of roughly 60 some odd businesses on whether or not it should be a 2-hour limit, a 3-hour limit, all that kind of stuff. And it was felt that, you know, a 1 or 2 hour limit, or having zones that might only be 1 hour, that actually may be kind of customer unfriendly. But it was felt that at a 3-hour limit, that gave just about every legitimate downtown customer the chance to shop, dine, do whatever they really needed to do, and still the 3 hours would not impact them negatively. So this, with the 3-hour limit that we currently have, this is really considered to be nothing but really good for customer parking and good for the businesses, because 3 hours was considered to be plenty of time for, so that none of our customers are really likely to get a ticket from this. That has not been my experience. They're actual customers. The only people who are going to get tickets from this are the employees and the even business owners that are parking all day in these spots.
Other comments? All right, Valerie made the motion that we create this parking enforcement officer position. Valerie, how do you vote?
Yes.
Joel?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Vanessa?
Yes.
Rob?
Yes.
Brian?
Yes.
DJ?
Yes.
Kurt?
Yes.
Motion passes. So that will come back on August 18th. We will need to make an adjustment to amend the classification plan. All right. Thanks to the staff who had to reevaluate. I know it was a little tough after that Republic discussion. Didn't go so well. Agenda review. Bless you in the back. We've got a next meeting coming up on Wednesday night. It is the Kiwanis Children's Cancer Program Month. We have a public hearing on a community development block grant Year 2 annual action plan, a public hearing on an ordinance that would amend the multiple dwelling portion of the Development Code, Articles 12, 19, and 22. A public hearing to consider an ordinance that would involve a property line vacation for smoky stoves. Council action for a budget adjustment. Council action for an intergovernmental agreement with Josephine County regarding the DMO. And a consent calendar item that would be a resolution for electrical maintenance services. and an appointment for the CEDC, a member to the CEDC. Any questions, comments about any of that? Nope. And then next Monday's workshop, I have a question. What is grand illumination, Aaron?
So in talking with staff, we discovered that grand illumination is the Christmas tree lighting. And in years past, we've had the city be responsible for the past couple of years. It was, before that, Town Center Association. And then when John Bowen took on the contract with Experience Grants Pass, council also provided him with some additional resources to do the grand illumination. Well, at this point, we really don't have money budgeted for the grand illumination, but we recognize that no one in the community is stepping up. And if we're actually going to have a tree this year and start that process, we actually need to get with the contractors as soon as possible. So have that there just to have an intro discussion with you, council, so you could determine if the city is going to take on the responsibility and maybe identify resources for tree acquisition and that grand illumination aspect.
Okay, thank you. And then also in that same workshop, we have a discussion coming up about the remodel and facade update for the Welcome Center building, as well as a discussion about funding for operating the Welcome Center. And Chief, last time we had a question about automatic responses that nobody knew the answer to, so we need the grand illumination.
Yeah, it's automatic responses. We have automatic aid built in throughout the county. We have some concern with some current automatic responses in North County, and we're going to bring that to your attention on Monday.
Sounds good. I think I may rearrange the order of that meeting just so you're not oddly sandwiched in between the Welcome Center Oreo, but anything else going forward? Brian?
Yeah, I was just going to ask why the minimum density conversation was moved from August 16th to the 30th, since it's been bumped several times already.
So the main staff on that is the staff liaison had a jury trial, and that was completely unexpected. He was 3.5 weeks out of the office on that trial. It was a murder trial, completely unexpected. So that's the main reason.
All right, thanks.
Questions, additions? All right.
I have one item.
Aaron?
I just have one item I want to bring to council's attention. We have coming up, and Karen and staff are trying to get the council registered for League of Oregon Cities. The website's been down this morning, and we haven't been able to do that, but today's the day. And we're very diligent in the past about getting that accomplished, so you have some decent rooms at the actual sponsored hotel. One of the things, though, is we have a meeting October 20th, a council meeting that night, and the conference starts first thing with and it's a good thing usually council members don't want to miss. It's the council member forum, which is Thursday morning at like 8:30. So I don't know if council may want to look at not holding the October 20th meeting so you can get there that night, because that's a first really impactful day, especially for new council members, to be able to participate with your peers in a specific council member training.
We could cancel the second meeting in October, or we could do meetings, Wednesday meetings, maybe move it up a week or back a week or something like that. Valerie?
I was just going to say, sometimes in the past, there are moments when you have to do something. So if we needed to have a special meeting on the Monday before, that would be my recommendation, is to cancel that meeting. And if there was something we needed to do, to try to make it a special meeting on the Monday
Just
prior.
do it on Monday. Brian?
Well, that's fine. I was just going to say another option is we could, if we had to have a meeting, we could do a remote meeting, because that's happened in the past.
All right. Well, October's way out, so we don't have to answer these questions today, but I guess if something does come up, we'll make arrangements.
The other thing is also with the League of Oregon Cities is they do have now the description of the trainings and especially the tours. The tours fill up really fast. So if you'd like to take a look at the tours and let Karen know if you want to do a tour, we'll try to get you registered for that. But we have had in past council members not be able to attend tours because they do fill up fast.
All right, how about we entertain a motion to adjourn into executive session? DJ,
I move to adjourn into executive session.
Valerie with the second, all in favor of adjourning and moving into an executive session? Aye, any
Aye.
opposed? All right. The council will now meet in executive session for the purpose of discussing those subjects previously noticed for this executive session, which is to discuss real estate property transactions. This executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.660 and more specifically under the objections of that statute, which have been publicly noticed for this meeting. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session. At the end of today's executive session, we're not expected to return to open session. We'll reconvene on Wednesday evening. And I think we need to wait for the TV camera to go off.